They were the all-American couple.
Good-looking family, great kids, lived in a great neighborhood.
She was a beautiful school teacher.
Alicia was the total package. She had beauty and brains.
He was a handsome veteran.
One of those type personalities that seemed like everybody loved.
But just when it seemed they were bound for a life of happiness, a hail of gunfire stopped them dead in their tracks.
Please help me, please help me, please help me. Ma'am? Somebody tell my husband.
The shooting sparked a frantic manhunt.
The murder had so many questions and not a lot of answers.
And would ultimately expose a tawdry tale laced with lies, lust, and revenge served up at point-blank range.
It wasn't all sunshine and candy bars.
So many twists and turns.
I was sitting on the edge of my seat, wondering what's gonna happen.
It reminds you of something from a movie.
June 3rd, 2004. It's a quiet summer evening in the upscale Jackson, Mississippi neighborhood of Lakeover.
You're talking about, a middle-class black professional neighborhood.
But at 11:10 p.m., an alarm is triggered at the home of Brian and Alicia Hughes.
It was loud enough and pronounced enough for me to know that something wasn't right.
When no one keys in the code, the security company calls the Hughes residence.
Somebody tell my husband. He's bleeding, please, somebody. Okay, ma'am, I'm going to call the police right back. Please, baby. Okay.
Officers race to the Hughes residence. Guns drawn, they step inside and find a scene of unimaginable horror.
They found Brian Hughes in the front room. He was actually lying face down on the floor.
A vast pool of blood surrounds Brian. His wife, Alicia, is trembling beside him.
Brian, baby, wake up, please.
She was hysterical, crying, screaming, "Somebody help my husband. I need some help."
Help me, somebody.
I screamed in vain. It was just unbelievable.
Officers attempt to administer first aid, but it's too late.
He was shot 5 times. The lethal shot entered his chest, and that's what killed him.
63, can you start us a couple of...
The major crimes unit is notified, and in a matter of minutes, homicide detectives are there to initiate a sweep of the home. There's no sign of the gunman or the murder weapon, but officers find the couple's 2 young daughters, safe and sound, asleep in their bedroom. It appears the only eyewitness is Brian's wife.
Now, I know you're disturbed, but can you tell me what happened here tonight?
Brian had went out with his brother, and I went to sleep in the room with my daughters, and I heard a pop.
Alicia's statement to the police was that she was sleeping in the bed with her daughters, and then she heard popping sounds.
She heard this pop, pop, pop sound, and she thought it was coming from the air conditioning system in their home.
According to Alicia, that's when the alarm sounded.
She went to turn off the alarm, realized the door was open, closed the door, and as she was walking back, she saw her husband lying in a pool of blood.
Please help me, please help me, please help me.
This was a bad nightmare for Alicia. She lost her husband, kids lost a father.
Brian Lamar Hughes was born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1974. Even as a child, Brian was a natural leader who attracted friends and followers.
Brian was just everybody's friend. You look in the crowd, everybody kind of standing around Brian. That Brian is their boy. He was a very likable person.
In high school, Brian excelled both in the classroom and on the playing field. Also blessed with good looks and personality, he was popular with the girls as well.
Brian was tall, dark, and handsome. Definitely the type of man a woman would find attractive.
But even in high school, Brian was always looking for that one special person.
Hey.
That is, until he laid eyes on fellow classmate Alicia Johnson.
So what you up to?
It was the end of class, and he was sitting there, and he was just looking at me.
Wanted to come through and tell you how pretty you were.
He was real spontaneous. He liked to do romantic things.
she was in love with him. Two young folks, who began a relationship as high school sweetheart.
Your first love is exciting. It feels like nobody in the world understands or can possibly imagine how you're feeling.
After high school, Brian and Alicia followed each other to nearby Jackson State University. But their newfound freedom and a sea of young co-eds quickly put their love for each other to the test.
They were still figuring out who they were, what they wanted, and Brian still had the desire to play around.
He was just a young man feeling his oats. I think Brian was into a lot of things.
Alicia and Brian ultimately decided to see other people. Shortly after that, Brian dropped out and enlisted in the Air Force.
Brian and Alicia's relationship was rocky in their 20s. It was on again, off again.
While Brian was in the Air Force, Alicia earned a master's degree in education and landed a teaching job at a local elementary school. Even though she dated other men during this time, Alicia still had a soft spot in her heart for Brian.
He was a good guy. He had a way about him where he could make you feel special, without really even trying.
And after 4 years in the Air Force, Brian returned to Jackson.
After the military, he came back home, and he followed in his father's footsteps and started working at Delphi Packard Electric.
What?
What you doing?
I'm washing dishes. What do you think?
But it wasn't just the job Brian came home for.
What you want me to do? Start right here?
You better stop.
They were still that young flame that was still going for each other. And they were able to rekindle that fire.
Brian and Alicia's desire for one another had never burned hotter. And this time, their passionate reunion was life-changing.
They were in love. That was her soulmate.
When Brian and Alicia hooked back up together, they were looking to build a life with each other and live that happily ever after together.
In the fall of 1999, almost a decade after they first started dating, Alicia and Brian welcomed the birth of their first child. 8 months later, they married.
So I just wanted to be, a good wife, a good mom, and good at what I did.
With the couple making good money, they bought and renovated a home in the charming middle-class neighborhood of Lakeover.
They're moving into this great neighborhood. It's like, wow, they're doing it right.
The couple had even more to celebrate when Alicia gave birth to another baby girl in 2001.
They have these great kids. You think they're just, building a great life for themselves and just living the American dream.
Which makes the nightmarish scene police encounter inside the Hughes residence all the more tragic.
Everybody was shocked that this thing could even have occurred to these two people.
But who would want to kill Brian Hughes? And why?
Still trying to piece of this.
As investigators dig deeper, a strange theory about the crime emerges. One that would shock everyone who'd ever known this seemingly storybook couple.
It's a true whodunit. And then when the story started to unravel, there was an even bigger mystery there.
High school sweethearts Brian and Alicia Hughes had gone their separate ways, only to reunite after college and reignite their red-hot romance.
Brian and Alicia were definitely a power couple. They seemed like the perfect romantic love story.
But that love story is ripped apart when police respond to a shooting at the Hughes residence and find Brian's body riddled with gunshot wounds.
It seemed like a mystery. No one knew exactly what happened on that night of June the 3rd, 2004.
A stunned Alicia tells police that she'd fallen asleep in her daughter's room, only to awake to the sound of what she thought was a noisy air conditioner. That's when the alarm sounded.
The door's open, the alarm system is going off. She goes into the front room and sees that her husband's been shot, and bleeding out everywhere.
It was surreal. It was like an out-of-body experience. You feel so inept.
You just start thinking like, wow, this poor woman, this happens to her husband and with her kids in the house.
Please help me, please help me.
As detectives console Alicia, officers begin processing the scene.
Were there any signs of forced entry?
No, sir. We checked all the doors and windows. If they came in, they had to come in through the front.
Okay, thank you.
But on the front porch, they find evidence that suggests the attack on Brian began near the door.
There were 3 shell casings outside the door.
In the den, police recover 3 more shell casings, which suggest a total of 6 rounds were fired, and all but 1 made contact with their target.
This murder was pretty brutal. Brian was shot multiple times, so whoever shot him definitely wanted him dead.
Just outside the couple's home, detectives noticed something else.
There were skid marks in the street right in front of the residence.
Somebody had a car sitting outside. They went up there and shot him. He got back in the car and sped away.
Between the shell casings, the skid marks, and the home's location in the upscale Lakeover neighborhood, authorities wonder if Brian has been the victim of a deadly robbery.
When I first heard about it, I thought that it was someone from the outside came in and committed the murder. Jackson has more murders than it should have. I thought it could have been a burglary gone bad.
But as they continue to search the residence, detectives realize there's a problem with that theory.
There was no sign of forced entry into the home. They didn't take anything.
As the mystery deepens, news of Brian's murder spreads through Jackson like wildfire.
My mom calls my phone, hysterical, crying. He's dead. Brian is dead. Brian is dead. They shot him and they killed him.
First thing I thought about, the 2 little girls. They don't have a daddy no more. And that made me mad. He was young.
Grieving friends and family soon converge on the Hughes residence. Police try to be sympathetic while preserving their crime scene.
Sir, we're still trying to piece the investigation together. Just hold tight, because we will have some questions for you later on.
The Hughes family was like a prominent family here in Jackson. The police allowed certain folks in the house, especially both relatives of Alicia Hughes and relatives of Brian Hughes, into the house that night.
Her family was there. A lot of people were there. Everybody was upset.
But no one seems more upset than Brian's wife.
Alicia's distraught. She can hardly speak. Understandably so, she's very, very upset.
I didn't want to be there. It was so difficult. It's just unbelievable.
In fact, Alicia is so distraught, she's of little use to detectives.
Listen, she's too upset, man. We're not going to get any information from her today.
Yeah, I agree. Let's cut her loose, and we'll talk to her in the morning.
A person in authority made the call to talk to her at a later time.
You got somewhere you can go with the kids?
Yeah.
Come on, we'll get you out.
Alicia packs an overnight bag, gathers her 2 girls, and heads to her mother's house. Meanwhile, detectives question friends and family gathered at the scene.
What's your name, sir?
Willie Hughes.
And who are you in relation to the victim?
I was his brother.
Can you tell me where you were tonight?
We just went out to grab a few drinks. We got some fast food, and I dropped him off, and that was the last time I saw him.
They had been out, having a good time. He dropped off his brother that night.
Think maybe somebody followed him home, rang the doorbell, and he let him in?
That may explain the unforced entry.
And the shell casings outside.
Investigators float this theory by Brian's family, but they find it hard to believe Brian would answer the door for anyone at such a late hour.
If you didn't call, and if you just go to the door and knock or ring the doorbell, he would not answer the door.
So if Brian wouldn't answer the door for a stranger, was it possible he knew his attacker? The answer to that question would scandalize all of Jackson, and in the process reveal a dark side to Brian and Alicia's romance. The fairy tale romance of Brian and Alicia Hughes has ended in a flurry of gunfire.
Baby, wake up, please.
And we're talking about just 2 great individuals, loving relationship, great, perfect family. And having gone through this was terrible.
Shell casings collected at the scene suggest Brian was initially shot near the front door, then again in the living room.
They were of the belief that someone, an outsider, broke in, obviously, because the alarm went off, and shot Mr. Hughes from that doorway.
But the lack of forced entry suggests Brian willingly let the shooter into his and Alicia's home. If that was the case, who was this mysterious acquaintance Brian allowed inside? And what sinister desires compelled them to murder him in cold blood? The one person who might help investigators answer that question is Brian's wife, Alicia. But the horror of discovering her husband's dead body has seemingly left Alicia too distraught to be of any use. And a few hours after the murder, detectives allow Alicia and her children to leave the scene and spend the night with some relatives. By the following morning, Alicia is ready to talk.
Good morning, Alicia. I just want to start off by thanking you for coming in this morning. I know you're distraught. I know it's a trying time. But I just wanted to ask you, is there anybody who would want to hurt Brian?
No. Everybody loved him.
Do you think you could walk us through the events of last night again?
Yeah, just put the girls to bed. And so I fell asleep.
Her story never changed, that she heard a loud popping or something.
I thought it was the air conditioning system, so I got up.
She said she went in the front room, and there she said she found her husband dead, lying on the floor.
Then the alarm company called and I answered the phone.
Though Alicia's statement doesn't get investigators any closer to cracking the case, it does seem to dovetail with evidence collected at the scene and allows them to essentially rule her out as a possible suspect. But before they release her, detectives ask Alicia to submit to a gunshot residue test.
It's just standard procedure.
Sure.
After a quick dusting of her hands, she is free to go.
Thank you, ma'am.
They let her go.
We'll see you out.
The detectives did not think that she was a suspect.
So who did have the opportunity and the motive to pull off this brutal attack?
It's one of those situations where, dead men can't talk.
Perhaps, but maybe the dead man's autopsy could.
Brian was shot in several areas. He was shot in the chest area, in the arm, in the thigh area. What was interesting about one of those shots, he was shot near the groin area.
It just makes you wonder what was really going on and what led to that. Was it a crime of passion? Was it rage?
It's an interesting question. Brian is a handsome, charming man who seems to have it all. Is it possible someone murdered him out of jealousy? In an effort to answer that question, investigators interview several of Brian's friends and co-workers.
Fred?
Yeah.
Hey, how you doing? Detective Daniels?
Nice to meet you.
This is my partner, Detective Gibson.
Nice to meet you.
In doing so, they unearth a shocking revelation.
Is there anything you can tell us about his lifestyle or shed any information on his life that might help us with this investigation?
I mean, Brian was a good man. He was there for his family, financially, but Brian loved women and women loved Brian. He never had any trouble meeting them.
So basically, he was a player.
Absolutely.
Many of his co-workers talked about how it was obvious that he was involved with women that he worked with. It was obvious that there was something intimate or romantic going on.
Brian could meet him anywhere because he knew every bar, every club, and he was friends with everybody. Jackson was his palate.
This is completely shocking that Brian, who lives this picture-perfect life, is having an affair.
Fred Clark Jr., a friend of Brian's, also tells police about a conversation he overheard just 2 weeks before Brian's murder.
Well, there was this one time I went over his house.
When I was walking in his front door, he was in this heated argument with this guy on the phone. The guy was cussing. I could hear the cuss words through the phone. And the dude was like saying, "I'm gonna get you."
Show up in my yard if you want to.
And he basically told the person on the phone, F you, do what you gotta do.
You. What's this all about, man?
He told me his girlfriend had been paying for his cell phone for about 2 years. And the girlfriend was married.
That was a husband on the phone.
Because they found out that he did have other lady friends, of course, anyone that would have been associated with them, the ladies as well as their partners, boyfriends or husbands, would be suspects.
That helps us a lot.
Sure.
Fred Clark's statement got investigators wondering. Had the woman's husband threatened to kill Brian if he didn't stop sleeping with his wife? And had Brian signed his own death warrant by daring the man to make good on it?
Brian is a man. I mean, you're not going to be intimidated by what another man's saying on the phone.
But who is Brian's mistress? And more importantly, who is the jealous husband? According to Brian's colleagues, the woman's name is Sandra Davis. She's married to Martin Davis, one of Brian's acquaintances. When confronted, Martin doesn't deny he'd recently discovered his wife was sleeping with Brian. Nor does he deny threatening Brian over the phone in a rage. Investigators are suspicious. They subpoena Brian's phone records to see if he'd been in contact with either of the Davises in the days leading up to the murder.
Investigators discovered that right before Brian's murder, that he was speaking to somebody on the phone.
Brian hung up the phone.
Gotta go.
That was about 10 minutes before he was killed.
Could this phone call be from Martin Davis or his wife? And is it another heated exchange that led to Brian's murder? In a case already dripping with allegations of infidelity and deceit, the answer to that question, the brutal slaying of Jackson, Mississippi native Brian Hughes has taken a bizarre turn. In speaking with friends and co-workers, detectives have learned the dream life Brian was living with his beautiful wife Alicia is a mirage, and that Brian was anything but a model husband.
The extramarital affairs and several women on the side, it just cracks the mirror of what you thought this family was like.
But the allegations of Brian's infidelity have allowed investigators to zero in on a possible suspect, a man named Martin Davis. Martin's wife Sandra had been having a torrid affair with Brian.
The husband threatened the next time he interacts with his wife, he was going to hurt Brian.
You. A search of cell phone records reveals Brian was on the phone with someone just minutes before he was murdered. Investigators suspect that if that phone number traces back to Martin Davis, then they've likely identified Brian's killer. But it turns out the number isn't registered to Martin Davis, but rather to one Robbie Rayford.
Was a possible jealous husband of one of the women that Brian was having an affair with.
But when investigators pay Robbie Rayford a visit, they're shocked by who greets them.
Hello. Hi. Can you speak to Robbie Rayford, please?
I'm Robbie Rayford. This Robbie person, whom Brian was speaking to before his murder, was actually a girl and not a guy.
Robbie is devastated to learn Brian has been murdered, and she pulls no punches as to why.
We've been sleeping together for 2 years. Brian and I are in love.
She talked about, how they had had relationships. They had had sex, numerous times.
When was the last time you spoke?
A few days ago.
Yeah, just got home.
She said she heard Brian come in, set the alarm system at the house, turn the TV on.
So I come see you tomorrow. Gotta go.
And then he said I have to go.
Is that unusual?
No, that's our code for my wife is in the room.
Robbie said that was the code word that, she and Brian used to let her know that Alicia was there.
If that's the case, that means that she was there in the living room and possibly during the time that he was killed.
Investigators are floored. Not only does Robbie Rayford's statement call into question Alicia Hughes' version of events, it vaults Alicia to the top of the list of possible suspects.
Maybe she heard him on the phone. He thought she was asleep. He was talking to his girlfriend. She got her gun. She walked into the living room where she pointed the gun at him.
Lock me one more time.
Come on.
Again and again and again.
Though it's admittedly hard for investigators to imagine the beautiful Alicia Hughes as a vengeful killer.
It just doesn't make sense that this lady, this petite, frail schoolteacher, would have killed him.
Although investigators can't help but think back to the intensely personal nature of Brian's injuries.
If Alicia is the shooter in this case, that groin shot was one that may have been personal for her. If you're gonna cheat on me, here's one for you.
But neither Brian's mortal wounds nor Robbie Rayford's statement are enough to concretely link Alicia to the murder. And forensic evidence collected at the scene still suggests that whoever shot Brian initiated the attack from just outside the front door.
There were 3 shell casings found outside the door on the doorstep. Somebody would have had to been out front shooting the gun.
Investigators decide to revisit the crime scene to see if there's anything they might have missed.
Just doesn't make sense.
There was no traces of blood from the front door. to where he was, where his body was found.
There's no blood splatter on the walls or nothing.
All the blood that was found was directly beneath his body on the floor in the living room. He was shot with a .45 caliber handgun. It's a big, large caliber handgun. He was shot 5 times. Somehow, from the foyer to the living room where his body was found, he didn't bleed one drop.
If he got shot by a .45, we would have had splatter on the floor, on the walls or something, but all the blood's right here.
Their theory was that someone actually got those shell casings from the inside and actually placed them on the outside.
If that's the case, then the shooting was initiated by someone inside the home.
Alicia?
And she staged the casings outside.
But what about the tire tracks found outside the couple's home? They suggest someone may have quickly fled the scene. In speaking with one of the Hughes neighbors, that fact is also called into question.
The women that we interviewed never said anything about they heard a car.
We don't know when they were put there. Skid marks can stay on pavement for months and months before they wear off from water and erosion. That's the problem with the skid marks.
The affairs, the blood evidence, Robbie Rayford's statement. It appears the circumstantial evidence now points to Alicia Hughes as her husband's killer. But is jealousy a bona fide motive?
Why couldn't she have just divorced him? If he had all these affairs and she was sick of him fooling around, you get a divorce. She was a school teacher. She had a job. The money's coming every month, so why kill him?
But when they pull Brian and Alicia's financial records, investigators find another clue.
There were 2 life insurance policies. One was $250,000, and I believe there was a small one for around $80,000. And that was going to go away once they got the divorce. Now, the way that wouldn't go away is if Brian died and she got the life insurance money.
Suspicion only deepens when investigators contact Brian and Alicia's insurance company. It turns out they had received a phone call from Alicia just weeks after Brian's death.
It's pretty shocking for Alicia to be inquiring about the interest that she would be making on her husband's life insurance policy, considering that her husband had been brutally murdered.
Still, without additional physical evidence, investigators have no way of charging Alicia with any crime. Then on February 3rd, 2005, investigators received word from the state crime lab. The results of the gunshot residue test, administered to Alicia almost as an afterthought, have come back positive.
Either you fired a gun, held a gun, or was close to when a gun was fired. Those are the only 3 reasons it would be on the back of your hand.
In addition to the gunshot residue, a deeper background check reveals Alicia had easy access to a gun similar to the murder weapon.
Brian apparently had owned a .45 caliber weapon that could not be found.
Still, one could argue the findings of the gunshot residue test aren't quite a slam dunk.
They only found 1 particle of gunshot residue on the back of her right hand.
But when coupled with the circumstantial evidence, it's enough to charge Alicia Hughes with the murder of her husband. The story is immediate front-page news in Jackson.
It was sensational. It was huge. I mean, you have this picture-perfect couple who were high school sweethearts, the perfect love story that ends in a tragic murder.
I didn't want to believe that she did it. I didn't want to.
But nobody claims to be more shocked by Alicia's arrest than Alicia herself.
You always assume that people are going to believe you. And so I always felt like, surely they can't consider me because, I've told the truth.
There was intense interest in this case because it had everything. It had the cheating husband. It had the wife accused of shooting her husband.
And as the case heads to trial, it becomes clear that a guilty verdict against this wife and mother On January 3rd, 2007, Alicia Hughes is escorted into a Jackson, Mississippi courtroom to stand trial for the first-degree murder of her high school sweetheart turned unfaithful husband, Brian. In their opening arguments, prosecutors come out swinging.
That Alicia Hughes, in fact, murdered her husband, Brian Hughes, in cold blood.
I told him exactly how she did it, how she waited for him to come home, how she walked in, how she confronted him, how he was on the phone with Robbie,
I'm sick of you lying to me!
how she shot him.
Lie to me one more time.
After pumping several shots from a .45 into Brian, Alicia allegedly staged the scene to look like an intrusion.
Their theory was that Alicia Hughes got those shell casings from the inside and actually placed them on the outside.
Prosecutors contend Alicia also feigned grief in order to convince police to let her leave the scene, which allowed her to smuggle the murder weapon out of the house in her overnight bag.
I believe this was all premeditated. She planned it. She waited for Brian to come in that night, and then she killed him. She's got two motives. One, the insurance money, and two, an unfaithful husband. You take your pick.
You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
To support their claim, the state calls Brian's lover, Robbie Rayford, to the stand.
Miss Rayford, can you please tell the court the nature of your relationship with Mr. Hughes?
We were lovers.
She's up there in front of the whole world, basically saying, I'm Brian's mistress. And she said she loved him, and her exact words were,
He was my soulmate.
Can you tell us about the events of June 3rd?
I was on the phone with him.
Yeah, just got home.
I heard him go in the house, and he says, I have to go.
Gotta go.
Then I asked him, is she in the room? And he said, yeah.
That's when he was shot.
And for the court, can you tell us who she is?
His wife.
Everything Robbie said fit with the physical evidence.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have to know that the physical evidence is not adequate to convict Alicia Hughes.
Alicia's defense team counters by attacking the physical evidence, namely the GSR test.
She had a speck of gunshot residue powder on her hand.
For someone to have shot a .45 caliber pistol 5 or 6 times, there'd be GSR on her hair, there'd be GSR on her face, on her arms. It wouldn't be one single particle.
They can't provide a weapon.
The defense also points out the lack of a murder weapon, which renders their theory about Alicia smuggling it out in her overnight bag mere conjecture.
If she could have done that good, she doesn't need to be here. She needs to be in Hollywood. You know, she's one of the best actresses ever lived.
On January 8th, 2007, 2.5 years after Brian's murder, both sides rest their case.
You had folks who said they thought Alicia Hughes was guilty. You had a lot of folks on the other side said this sweet teacher couldn't have killed her husband.
2 hours later, the jury returns with its verdict.
The jurors were saying, guilty, guilty, all 12 of them, just over and over again. And I was still trying to grasp, onto that and trying to keep my face straight.
We were in total shock and disbelief. She couldn't believe it.
Alicia Hughes, please stand. Mrs. Hughes, on the charge of murder in the first degree, I am sentencing you to life in prison.
Alicia just stood there like, there's no way.
As she's carted off to the penitentiary, tears flow from both her supporters and Brian's grieving family.
Brian and Alicia had known each other since high school, so these are also two families that had known each other for many years. And to be divided because of a situation like this made it really tough.
But before either side can put this tragedy behind them, they'll be blindsided by an unlikely turn of events that forces everyone to question whether Alicia Hughes was a cold-blooded killer. In January of 2007, Alicia Hughes is convicted of murdering her husband and former high school sweetheart, Brian.
The jury found her guilty of killing her husband. Brian Hughes' family, they believe that justice was served.
But immediately following Alicia's conviction, her attorneys file an appeal, arguing prosecutor Stan Alexander unfairly struck jurors in the selection process on the basis of race and gender.
All you heard was Stan was racist. He didn't want black women on the jury. And it's ridiculous. I'm married to a black woman. My mother's a black woman.
Surprisingly, presiding Judge Winston Kidd grants the appeal, ruling that Alicia's right to a fair trial amongst her peers had been violated. In essence, overturning his own verdict.
It was like just instant relief. It was just absolutely an incredible feeling.
On November 5th, 2007, 9 months after her first trial ended, Alicia Hughes walks back into a Mississippi courtroom to stand trial once again for the murder of her husband, this time with a new panel of jurors. And again, the state argues that the evidence still points to just one person.
After we read the entire book, and not just read the cover, you're going to find out that the story of Alicia Hughes' life is that she's guilty of murder.
Prosecutors also called Brian's lover, Robbie Rayford, to the stand to help corroborate their version of events.
But what did those words mean to you when he was at home?
It meant that his wife was in his presence.
As in the first trial, Robbie Rayford's testimony seems to connect the dots of the state's case, particularly as it relates to the blood evidence.
There's no way possible you get shot at the front door with a 45 5 times and don't bleed until you get back to the living room floor.
But when it's their turn, Alicia's defense team takes a new approach. And this time, they're armed with some serious legal firepower.
They brought in a top-notch attorney, Dennis Sweet. He's really a high-profile attorney in this area.
Sweet starts by criticizing investigators and the chaos that permeated their crime scene.
The defense pointed out that numerous folks, individuals, were allowed in the house that same night during the shooting, which may have contaminated things.
They didn't secure the scene. The crime scene investigator himself is pretty good. He doesn't lie. His crime scene was not secured. He came in, he's not supposed to secure it, he's supposed to investigate it. So it was like Grand Central Station going through it. He said, yeah.
With so much foot traffic at the crime scene and so many alleged affairs, Sweet asserts it's impossible to determine exactly who killed Brian.
The problems I saw were mainly the infidelity. It came out later on. I feel strongly it's not family, and I think there is some gunman out there who, for whatever reason, whether it's a jilted lover or whether it's some drug dealer that came and killed him. I feel like there's somebody still out there.
After running through the laundry list of jilted lovers and seething spouses who might want Brian dead, the defense turns to another piece of unexplained evidence: the skid marks found outside the home the night of the murder.
They said that skid marks could be there and there was no way to date them.
But Dennis Sweet claims he's found someone who can.
Dennis went and knocked on doors, and he found a neighbor that said, the police never interviewed me. They never come to my house.
On the stand, the Hughes neighbor Dorothea Presley tells the court that on the night of the murder, she awoke to the sound of gunfire.
After you heard the shots, what did you hear anything else?
Shortly thereafter, I heard a car skid away.
She heard the squelching of an automobile tire, like someone, leaving real fast after she heard gunshots. This lady had impeccable credibility, and I think that single witness probably provided the boost to the defense case.
On November 16, 2007, the jury once again breaks for deliberation.
I believe everybody was sitting on the edge of their chair wondering, what are they about to tell us? The courtroom was quiet. It seemed like it took forever for the jury to walk in and sit down.
Again, it takes just 2 hours for the jury to return with a verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty.
When that second jury came back not guilty, it just doesn't get any better than that.
I don't even remember hearing all the words that were said after the not guilty.
Boston 1994 cold case solved. Billionaire philanthropist exposed as serial killer. The cobblestones of Boston's historic Beacon Hill have spent 32 years sweating out a secret that smelled of high society, old money, and cold, coagulated blood. In the freezing winter twilight of December 1994, while the rest of the city was wrapped in festive lights and the artificial warmth of holiday consumerism, a 22-year-old Harvard graduate student named Sarah Pendleton vanished into thin air just 3 blocks from her apartment. Her coat, a distinctive emerald green wool, was found neatly folded on a bench overlooking the frozen waters of the Charles River, but her body, her life, and her future were swallowed whole by the darkness of an era before smartphones and pervasive street surveillance. For more than 3 decades, the file sat in a cardboard box beneath the leaking pipes of the Boston Police Department's homicide archive, a stubborn ghost categorized under the agonizing label of a cold case. The city's elite whispered that she had run away, that the pressure of her academic life had cracked her mind, or that she had fallen victim to a random, migratory predator passing through the South Station transit lines. They spun these comfortable lies because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate, that the monster who tore Sarah from the world didn't live in the gutters, but in the highest penthouses overlooking the Boston Public Garden. It took 32 years for the technological landscape to catch up with a killer's meticulously hidden pathology, but a single microscopic hair, trapped in the rusted teeth of an old brass zipper on that emerald coat, was about to detonate a psychological bomb that would tear the pristine, charitable facade of New England's high society completely to pieces. The scene in December 1994 was defined by a primitive forensic infrastructure and a profound, institutional desperation that allowed the trail to go ice-cold before the first snows of January could melt. When detectives first examined the frozen riverbank where Sarah's coat was recovered, they found themselves staring at an evidentiary void. The extreme winter temperatures had crystallized the mud, preventing the collection of clear footwear impressions, and the heavy falling sleet had washed away any potential trace fluids. The police were working in the dark, relying on paper logs, landline tip lines, and the faulty memories of eyewitnesses who claimed to see a dark luxury sedan idling near the footbridge around the estimated time of her disappearance. The neighborhood was instantly paralyzed by a suffocating paranoia, a quiet horror that settled over the ivy-covered brownstones as young women realized that the historic charm of their gaslit streets was now a tactical hunting ground. Rumors swirled through the university campuses, pointing fingers at lonely academic rivals, strange dockworkers from the Boston Harbor, or transit drifters, while the real architect of the nightmare sat in a high-backed leather chair just 2 miles away, cutting multi-million-dollar checks for the city's children's hospital. As the years bled into decades, the disappearance of Sarah Pendleton mutated into a grim piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to incoming freshmen during orientation week about the dangers of the city's historic alleys. Her parents spent their life savings on private investigators, exhausting their emotional and financial reserves before dying brokenhearted in a quiet suburb of Connecticut, their daughter's bedroom kept exactly as it was on the night she vanished. Meanwhile, a prominent billionaire philanthropist named Julian Vance was transforming himself into the very heartbeat of Boston's civic pride, his name carved into the marble arches of museum wings, university libraries, and state-of-the-art medical research facilities. Vance was a master of public relations, a silver-haired patrician whose soft, compassionate voice regularly graced the stages of high society charity galas, demanding justice for the marginalized and throwing millions at programs designed to protect vulnerable youth. He was a man above suspicion, a living saint wrapped in bespoke Italian suits, whose philanthropic empire was viewed as the ultimate manifestation of civic virtue, while his private journals, locked inside a digital vault beneath his maritime estate, recorded the exact biological mechanics of how Sarah Pendleton had gasped for her final breath. The turning point came with the quiet entry of a new generation of investigators who didn't grow up under the shadow of Julian Vance's immense political influence, young analysts armed with tools that the old-school lawmen of the 90s couldn't have envisioned in their wildest dreams. In the spring of 2026, the Boston Police Department's newly reorganized cold case squad launched an aggressive, systematic re-examination of unsolved homicides from the pre-digital era, utilizing high-density forensic DNA phenotyping and investigative genetic genealogy. A young forensic specialist named David Chun pulled Sarah's file from the dark recesses of the archive, his attention immediately captured by the emerald green wool coat that had been preserved in a vacuum-sealed plastic evidence bag. The original technicians had used primitive swabbing techniques that barely scratched the surface of the fabric, but Chun possessed a tool that could extract genetic data from the impossible, a vacuum-assisted trace evidence retrieval system capable of pulling microscopic skin cells and hair fragments from deep within the weave of the textiles. The vacuum extraction yielded a single, pristine follicle of human hair that had remained wedged in the inner lining of the coat's brass zipper for 32 years, an environmental time capsule that had successfully resisted degradation. Chun ran the sample through a massive mitochondrial DNA sequencing protocol, generating a complex, high-definition genetic map that did not match anyone in the National Criminal Database, meaning the donor had never been printed, booked, or convicted of a felony in his long life. But the digital universe did something far more devastating. It mapped the profile against public genealogical platforms, searching for segments of shared centimorgans that indicated an elite, ancestral lineage rooted deep in the historical aristocracy of New England. The algorithm began to tighten its digital noose around a highly specific branch of an old industrial family tree, a line that led straight through the boardroom doors of Vance Global Enterprises, shocking the analysts as they realized they weren't looking at a career criminal, but a man who held the financial strings of the city itself. The genealogical mapping narrowed the suspect pool down with a cold, mathematical ferocity, eliminating relatives who were out of the country or too young in 1994 until a single name flashed at the terminal end of the computational pipeline: Julian Vance. The investigative team sat in absolute, stunned silence. They were looking at a man who regularly dined with senators, governors, and police commissioners, a titan of industry whose arrest would trigger a systemic crisis across the state's financial and charitable institutions. The operation to secure a direct, matching DNA sample from the billionaire had to be executed with the stealth of a black ops mission, as a standard search warrant would tip off his high-priced legal team and allow him to board his private Gulfstream jet before a single patrol car could clear his driveway. For 2 weeks, undercover state troopers shadowed Vance as he moved between his Beacon Hill penthouse and his corporate headquarters, waiting for a single, careless human error from a man who prided himself on absolute control. The moment materialized at an exclusive $500 a plate charity breakfast at the Boston Marriott, where Vance was the keynote speaker, preaching to a room full of corporate executives about the moral obligation of wealth. He sat at the head table, looking serene and majestic, sipping a glass of mineral water and occasionally blotting his lips with a linen napkin before leaving the stage to a standing ovation. The moment his luxury town car pulled away from the hotel valet, an undercover officer disguised as a banquet waiter stepped up to the table, securing the crystal water glass with a pair of sterile tweezers and sliding it into a protective canvas bag. The laboratory analysis took less than 24 hours. The fresh epithelial cells harvested from the rim of the glass delivered an absolute 1 in a billion match against the 40-year-old hair follicle trapped in the zipper of Sarah Pendleton's coat. The billionaire saint of Boston was a serial killer. The execution of the arrest warrant was scheduled for a crisp Tuesday morning outside his corporate tower in the financial district, designed to minimize the chance of a private security intervention or a high-speed flight risk from his secure residential compounds. As the black, unmarked SUVs swerved into the executive drop-off zone, pinning Vance's armored limousine against the concrete barrier, the city's heart seemed to skip a beat. Vance was stepping out of the vehicle, flanked by 2 private bodyguards, when heavily armed state tactical officers emerged with their weapons drawn, shouting commands that broke the morning corporate routine like a lightning strike. He didn't scream, he didn't run, and his bodyguards immediately lowered their hands as they recognized the badges of the state's highest law enforcement agency. Vance simply stopped, his face freezing into a cold, mask-like expression of absolute aristocratic contempt as the steel handcuffs clicked locked around his silver-cuffed wrists. The news broke across the globe like a tectonic rupture, dominating international financial and news networks as the headline flashed across millions of screens. Boston 1994 cold case solved. Billionaire philanthropist exposed as serial killer. Members of the public gathered outside the courthouse in a state of collective psychological shock, staring at the mugshot of a man who had been the face of New England's high culture, now stripped of his lighting, his wealth, and his prestige. Inside the interrogation room, the facade of the benevolent patriarch didn't just crack. It shattered completely beneath the weight of an airtight prosecution that laid out 40 years of secret pathology alongside the digital certainty of the genomic data. Vance sat beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, his pristine silk tie removed, looking at a wall of forensic evidence that linked him not just to Sarah Pendleton, but to 6 other young women who had vanished along the eastern seaboard between 1988 and 2002. He began to speak, not in the warm, compassionate baritone of his charity speeches, but in a low, chillingly detached whisper that was captured by the studio microphones, detailing the absolute randomness and cold malice of his hunts. He admitted that his entire philanthropic empire was built as a secondary playground for his sadism, a grand psychological experiment where he could absorb the grief of the city he was systematically bleeding dry. He had funded missing children's foundations using the money he generated from the industries that funded his lifestyle, drawing a dark, chaotic thrill from sitting at tables with the very officials who were searching for the phantoms he left in the dark. He had outlived the original detectives. He had buried his victims in the concrete foundations of his own commercial real estate developments, and he had almost convinced himself that he was a god who could dictate who lived and who died in his private kingdom. The legacy of Julian Vance is now written in the history books not as a story of wealth and virtue, but as a terrifying monument to the capacity of human deception, a warning that the greatest monsters are often those who wear the finest armor. The museum wings that bear his name are being quietly scraped clean of his letters, the university foundations are liquidating his trusts, and the city's elite are left to look into the mirror, wondering how they allowed a predator to buy their silence with a smile and a check. The cold waters of the Charles River still flow past Beacon Hill, but the air feels different now, cleared of the heavy, suffocating mystery that choked the community for 32 long years. The memory of Sarah Pendleton has finally been brought out of the basement archive and into the light, a stark reminder that no matter how deep an atrocity is buried, the truth remains waiting in the dark, carried on a microscopic strand of life, ready to tear down the temples of the wicked and bring the ghosts of the past home for their final, terrifying reckoning. 2. The hunting grounds of the Commonwealth. The cobblestones of Beacon Hill do not absorb blood. They merely allow it to pool in the narrow crevices between the ancient, water-smoothed granite blocks, hiding it from the dim illumination of the gas lamps that have flickered in the historic heart of Boston since the 19th century. To truly comprehend the absolute chilling nature of the winter of 1994, one must strip away the modern, hyper-illuminated reality of 21st century Boston and return to an era when the city was a tapestry of stark, unmonitored shadows. Beacon Hill was, and remains, an enclave of immense, multi-generational wealth, a neighborhood where federal-style brick row houses stand shoulder to shoulder, their polished brass door knockers and pristine small-pane windows projecting an image of absolute social stability and puritanical rectitude. It was a neighborhood where people assumed that the high cost of real estate acted as a natural barrier against the chaotic violence that was plaguing the outer rims of the Commonwealth during the mid-1990s. This very sense of unshakable security was the first and most critical weapon that Julian Vance utilized when he transformed the historic labyrinth of his own neighborhood into a private, highly controlled slaughterhouse. In December 1994, Sarah Pendleton was the bright, incandescent center of a world that was entirely unprepared for the entry of a systematic predator. At 22, she was completing her master's thesis in historical architecture at Harvard University, a brilliant young woman whose academic work focused on the preservation of the very brownstones that lined the streets of her neighborhood. Her life was an orderly, intellectually vibrant routine of library archives, late-night study sessions, and brisk walks through the chilly winter air to her modest apartment on Pinckney Street. On the evening of December 14th, the atmospheric conditions over the city were treacherous. A heavy, localized nor'easter had dumped a thick, slushy mix of freezing rain and heavy sleet across the metro area, turning the brick sidewalks into treacherous ribbons of black ice. The ambient noise of the city was completely muffled by the heavy falling weather, creating an eerie, claustrophobic silence that drove the resident population indoors far earlier than usual. Sarah had remained late in the basement archives of the Boston Athenaeum, one of the oldest independent libraries in the United States, located just a short distance from the State House. When she finally packed her heavy leather satchel and stepped out onto the sidewalk at 9:45 p.m., the street was entirely deserted, the yellow glare of the gas lamps reflecting off the wet, freezing brickwork like spilled oil. She pulled the collar of her emerald green wool coat tight against her neck, her leather boots clicking a sharp, rhythmic cadence that echoed down the narrow, high-walled alleyways as she took her standard shortcut through Mount Vernon Square. It was a route that she had walked 1,000 times, a path bordered by multi-million-dollar homes whose heavy velvet drapes were drawn tightly against the winter storm, completely sealing the wealthy occupants inside their private worlds of warmth and privilege. The physical architecture of Mount Vernon Square at that specific hour was a tactical paradise for an apex predator who had spent his entire life studying the blind spots of the city's upper crust. The square was lined with massive, 5-story brick mansions whose deep, recessed entryways and stone carriage houses created permanent pockets of absolute blackness that the weak, historical gas lighting could never fully penetrate. The freezing rain had created a high-velocity wind tunnel between the buildings, the roaring gales through the bare oak trees providing a natural acoustic blanket that could instantly swallow the sound of a brief, sudden struggle. Julian Vance did not choose this location by accident. He owned 2 of the commercial properties at the southern edge of the square, and he knew down to the exact foot where the city's municipal camera coverage ended and where the private security blind spots began. He had been idling in his dark luxury sedan for 45 minutes, the engine running with a low, mechanical hum that was completely obscured by the howling storm, watching the eastern approach through his heavily tinted side windows. The execution of the abduction was a terrifying manifestation of clinical precision and total physical dominance, a strike so clean that it left no trace evidence for the primitive forensic teams of 1994 to harvest. As Sarah rounded the corner of the brick wall, her footing slightly unsteady on the accumulating ice, Vance stepped out from the deep shadow of an arched carriage gateway. He did not look like a street thug or a desperate back-alley mugger. He was dressed in an expensive, full-length cashmere overcoat, his silver hair neatly styled, projecting the immediate, unshakable aura of a wealthy neighbor who had stepped outside to check on his property. This split-second visual misdirection was all the psychological leverage he required. In the brief moment that Sarah's defensive instincts hesitated, her mind categorizing him as a safe, respectable authority figure rather than a lethal threat, Vance closed the physical distance with explosive, athletic ferocity. His left arm, conditioned by years of private fitness coaching and maritime sailing, locked around her neck in a high-leverage sleeper hold, his gloved hand instantly sealing her mouth to prevent the escape of a single scream. Simultaneously, his right hand deployed a highly concentrated, medical-grade chemical aerosol directly into her nasal passages, a fast-acting anesthetic agent that he had sourced through one of his pharmaceutical distribution companies. Within 4 seconds, Sarah's central nervous system collapsed into a state of chemical paralysis, her heavy leather satchel slipping from her fingers and landing silently in the slush as her body went entirely limp in his arms. Vance caught her before she hit the granite blocks, lifting her with a cold, detached efficiency and sliding her into the deep, leather-lined rear cabin of his vehicle before retrieving her fallen bag and clearing the slush of any immediate signs of disturbance. He did not immediately drive out of the neighborhood. Instead, he drove 3 blocks north, parking the vehicle in the private, underground garage of one of his residential brownstones on Brimmer Street. It was here, in the climate-controlled, soundproofed basement of an empty luxury property he was preparing for the real estate market, that the true horror of his pathology was realized over the next 6 hours. Vance had constructed a specialized, hidden chamber behind a false utility wall in the boiler room, a space equipped with surgical lighting, stainless steel tables, and an array of recording equipment that allowed him to document every physiological transition of his victims with the cold, analytical detachment of a research scientist. He did not assault them in the traditional manner of a disorganized street predator. His sadism was entirely intellectual and possessive, a dark, chaotic desire to witness the precise moment where a human being's identity dissolves into the absolute void of death. He spent the night recording Sarah's vital signs, utilizing high-end medical monitors to watch her heart rate spike and flutter as the chemical paralytic slowly wore off, leaving her fully conscious, but completely incapable of movement or speech. He sat beside the table in a comfortable leather chair, sipping a glass of expensive scotch, speaking to her in a low, soothing, pastoral tone about the architectural history of the city, treating her final hours as a private, exclusive lecture for an audience of one. When the clock in the boiler room neared 3:30 a.m., Vance utilized a highly specialized, ultra-thin wire ligature to slowly, systematically extinguish her life, watching her eyes through a high-magnification lens to capture the exact microsecond where the pupil dilated permanently, signaling the departure of her consciousness. He felt a profound, godlike surge of absolute authority, a psychological high that was infinitely more intoxicating than the acquisition of a new corporate empire or the public adulation of the city's elite. At 4:45 a.m., while the nor'easter was delivering its final, heaviest band of snow, Vance transported her emerald green wool coat to the lonely boardwalk overlooking the frozen Charles River Basin, folding it with meticulous, geometric neatness and placing it on a green park bench. This was his ultimate piece of theatrical misdirection, a psychological breadcrumb designed to force the police department to waste their early, critical investigative hours dragging the freezing depths of the river under the assumption that they were dealing with a tragic, cold-weather suicide. He then returned to his vehicle, driving 70 miles north to a private, deep-water maritime slip he owned in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where his luxury motor yacht was moored. He had encased Sarah's body in a specialized, high-density industrial polymer shroud, weighted down with 50 pounds of scrap anchor chain from his corporate shipping yards. He steamed 12 miles out into the black, freezing waters of the Atlantic Ocean, dropping her into a 300-foot marine trench where the shifting undercurrents and deep-water scavengers would ensure that her physical remains would never rise to trouble his pristine public life. The following afternoon, Thursday, December 15th, the initial missing persons report was filed by Sarah's roommate when she failed to return for their morning seminar at Harvard. The response from the Boston Police Department was initially slow, hampered by the massive logistical chaos caused by the nor'easter, which had stranded hundreds of motorists and caused dozens of structural failures across the city. When a Parks Department worker finally discovered the emerald coat on the bench at noon, the case was immediately funneled toward the Marine Division. Detective Sergeant Thomas Burke, a veteran investigator whose mind was hardened by decades of dealing with the grim realities of the city's waterfront, stood on the freezing boardwalk, his heavy trench coat flapping in the bitter wind as he looked down at the neatly folded wool garment. The scene was a procedural disaster from a modern forensic perspective. The heavy snowfall had covered the bench in a thick, 6-inch mantle of white, which the responding patrol officers had clumsily brushed away with their gloved hands, completely obliterating any trace fibers or latent prints that Vance might have left behind during the staging process. The coat itself was soaked through with freezing slush and river spray, its fibers holding a wealth of contaminated moisture that the primitive department crime lab was entirely unequipped to handle. Burke noted the geometric neatness of the fold, a detail that didn't align with the erratic, chaotic behavior typical of a young student undergoing a sudden, acute psychological break. He ordered the river to be dragged, a massive, expensive operation that involved divers freezing in the zero-visibility waters of the Charles for 7 days, their hooks tearing through the river mud but finding nothing but discarded tires, old bicycles, and the industrial detritus of a century of manufacturing. While the police were freezing on the riverbank, Julian Vance was standing in the grand ballroom of the Copley Plaza Hotel, hosting the annual winter fundraiser for the Boston Children's Advocacy Network. He was the very picture of New England elegance, his silver hair catching the amber glow of the crystal chandeliers as he stood before a crowd of 500 of the state's most powerful political and financial leaders. He delivered a stunning, emotionally charged speech about the moral necessity of protecting the city's vulnerable youth, his voice cracking with a perfectly rehearsed empathy that brought many in the audience to tears. He announced a personal, matching donation of $2 million to fund new shelter beds and emergency hotlines, a gesture that was met with a thunderous, 3-minute standing ovation that solidified his position as the supreme moral shepherd of the Commonwealth's elite. Among those applauding in the front row was the city's police commissioner, a man whose upcoming re-election campaign was being heavily subsidized by one of Vance's private political action committees. When Detective Burke attempted to expand the investigation the following week, demanding to run a check on all luxury vehicles registered in the Beacon Hill area or to interview the wealthy property owners surrounding Mount Vernon Square regarding their private security logs, he hit a wall of polite but absolute bureaucratic resistance from the upper echelons of his own department. He was told in no uncertain terms that the department could not afford to harass the city's highest taxpayers and civic leaders with groundless fishing expeditions based on a simple missing persons case that had all the hallmarks of a voluntary disappearance or a tragic suicide. The file was quietly steered away from the active homicide desk, its pages gathering dust in a blue cardboard folder while Julian Vance went back to his high-rise boardroom. Looking out over the city he was systematically preying upon, entirely secure in the knowledge that his wealth had purchased him a permanent, holy immunity from the laws of men. The calcification of a city's memory is a silent, structural phenomenon, an invisible masonry that seals away the uncorrected horrors of the past to maintain the pristine equilibrium of the present. By the dawn of the millennium, the disappearance of Sarah Pendleton had completed its transformation from a raw, bleeding police emergency into a cold, historical footnote, a ghost story preserved only in the yellowed newsprint of the Boston Globe archives and the recurring nightmares of her surviving classmates. The Boston Police Department, bruised by the high-crime waves of the late 90s and struggling to adapt to a rapidly modernizing urban landscape, had long since filed Box 94 to 1108 into the deepest recesses of its climate-compromised storage facility beneath the Suffolk County Courthouse. The file was functionally dead, buried under an unyielding mountain of fresh, active homicides, gang wars, and the geopolitical anxieties that redefined the American law enforcement apparatus after the turn of the century. While Sarah's memory faded into a quiet, academic legend, Julian Vance was systematically transforming his immense inherited fortune into an absolute, unassailable fortress of civic and moral authority. The decade between 1995 and 2005 was a golden age of expansion for Vance Global Enterprises, with the billionaire capitalizing on the early tech boom and the aggressive deregulation of the maritime shipping industry to double his net worth before his 45th birthday. But Vance understood that in the rigid, multi-generational hierarchy of New England's high society, raw liquid capital was a crude, vulgar weapon. True, permanent power required the acquisition of absolute social reverence, a public reputation so pristine and benevolent that it functioned as an invisible shield against any form of official scrutiny or legal accountability. He began a monumental, highly publicized campaign of architectural philanthropy, donating staggering sums to the city's most revered cultural and educational institutions. At Harvard University, his alma mater, he funded the construction of the Vance Hall of Genomic Sciences, a sterile, hypermodern complex of glass and steel that sat in stark, jarring contrast to the historic red brick dormitories where Sarah Pendleton had once studied. In the Longwood medical area, his multi-million-dollar grants established the Julian Vance Center for Pediatric Neurology, a world-class facility where the nation's top medical minds worked under his direct administrative patronage to heal the most complex neurological disorders afflicting the children of the Commonwealth. His name was no longer just a corporate entity. It was carved into the very marble foundations of the city, transforming him into a living monument of civic virtue and human compassion. The psychological engineering of Vance's double life during this era of immense public expansion was a terrifying display of absolute, clinical compartmentalization. He possessed an uncanny, almost supernatural ability to partition his consciousness, existing simultaneously as a highly rational, compassionate captain of industry and a cold, calculating sexual sadist who viewed human beings as disposable biological specimens. In his grand executive suite on the 45th floor of the Vance Tower, he would sit at a massive, custom-built desk of polished obsidian, running international maritime fleets and orchestrating global charity networks with a serene, flawless focus. Yet, inside the internal safe of his bespoke leather briefcase, resting beneath highly confidential corporate mergers and state tax exemptions, lay a tiny, tarnished brass artifact, the severed zipper slider from Sarah Pendleton's emerald green wool coat. It was his ultimate psychological anchor, a physical key that allowed him to instantly slip away from the high-pressure demands of his corporate empire and re-immerse himself in the dark, godlike euphoria of the night he extinguished her life. The absolute chilling perfection of his disguise was demonstrated with horrific clarity during the annual Boston Symphony Orchestra Winter Gala, an event that Vance had personally subsidized and elevated into the premier social gathering of New England's financial and political elite. Every January, the historic Symphony Hall was filled with a sea of black tuxedos and designer silk gowns, with senators, Supreme Court judges, and foreign diplomats gathering to celebrate the cultural richness of the Commonwealth. Vance was always the unchallenged patriarch of the gala, moving through the opulent crowds with a smooth, effortless elegance, his silver hair neatly tailored, his piercing blue eyes radiating a deep, comforting intellect. He would stand beneath the towering gold pipes of the great organ, a glass of vintage champagne held casually in his gloved hand, discussing the philosophical necessity of beauty and art with the very state Supreme Court justices who would later sign the warrants that exposed his true nature. He was a master of psychological camouflage, utilizing his immense philanthropic resources to position himself as the ultimate defender of the weak. In 2002, following a series of high-profile, unsolved abductions along the transit corridors of the Northeast, Vance launched the Commonwealth Safe Streets Initiative, donating $5 million of his private fortune to install high-intensity lighting systems and emergency call boxes in the historic alleys and public parks of Boston. He stood on the steps of the State House alongside the governor and the police commissioner, delivering a powerful, televised speech that condemned the rising tide of urban violence and demanded a relentless, uncompromising crusade against the predators who threaten the safety of the city's women. He was publicly funding the very security measures that he was privately studying for weaknesses, utilizing his administrative access to the city's logistical planning sessions to ensure that his own hunting grounds remained perfectly unmonitored and entirely lethal. Meanwhile, the psychological decay of Oakhaven and the academic community that had loved Sarah Pendleton was complete. Her childhood friends, now moving into their 30s and 40s, had learned to carry her disappearance as a permanent, silent scar, an unresolved trauma that contaminated their relationship with the city. The brownstones of Beacon Hill, once viewed as symbols of unshakable security and historic charm, were now perceived through a lens of quiet, suffocating paranoia, their dark alleys and deep carriage arches serving as reminders that a young woman could step out of a library and vanish from the face of the earth without a single soul hearing her scream. The collective amnesia that the city's elite had applied to the case had done its work. The narrative had been successfully rewritten to classify Sarah's fate as a tragic, random anomaly, a migratory crime that had nothing to do with the righteous, high-minded society that controlled the levers of power in the Commonwealth. Yet, deep within the subterranean vaults of the Suffolk County Justice Center, the physical reality of December 14, 1994, refused to dissolve into historical irrelevance. The Cold Case Archive was an underworld of forgotten atrocities, a vast, silent labyrinth of rusting steel shelves and dust-covered cardboard boxes that sat directly beneath the busy feet of the state prosecutors and defense attorneys who marched through the daily courts. Box 94 to 1108 remained exactly where Detective Burke had deposited it before his retirement, its cardboard sides warped by decades of seasonal humidity, its contents holding the quiet, microscopic evidence of a billionaire's damnation. The emerald green wool coat lay in the dark, preserved within its heavy plastic evidence bag, the microscopic hair follicles still trapped in the rusted teeth of the internal brass zipper, a biological time capsule waiting for a future generation of hunters who would look past the marble monuments of Julian Vance to find the monster hiding in the stone. As the decade turned toward the 2010s, Vance's confidence grew into an absolute, unshakable sense of cosmic immunity. He had survived the transition into the digital age. He had outlived the original investigators who had walked the freezing banks of the Charles River. He had successfully buried his secrets beneath layers of concrete foundations and multi-million-dollar hospital wings. He had become an institution, a structural pillar of the city's identity, a man whose public existence was so thoroughly integrated into the charitable and cultural fabric of New England that his ruin would mean the collapse of the very institutions that define the moral vanity of the Commonwealth. He had conquered history itself, or so he believed, as he sat in his penthouse suite overlooking the frozen expanse of the public garden, completely blind to the fact that the digital world was constructing a new kind of net, a mathematical ocean of genetic code that could reach back through decades of silence to pull a king down from his throne. The modern machinery of justice does not look for fingerprints left in blood. It searches for the invisible, digitized sequences of life that a killer leaves behind in the deep fibers of the past. By the winter of 2025, the Boston Police Department's newly formed Forensic Genetic Intelligence Unit had established its headquarters in a sterile, white-tiled laboratory suite on the top floor of the Schiller Justice Building. This wasn't a room populated by old-school street detectives with leather jackets and short-barreled revolvers. This was a fortress of molecular biology, staffed by data engineers, clinical geneticists, and high-velocity computational analysts who treated an unsolved homicide not as a narrative mystery, but as an archival data problem waiting for the correct technological excavation tools. At the center of this unit stood Dr. Clara Thorne, a 34-year-old molecular forensic specialist who had spent her academic career at MIT developing protocols for the extraction of low-copy number, highly degraded DNA from historical evidence. To Dr. Thorne, the cardboard boxes gathering dust in the county's subterranean vaults weren't just monuments to human tragedy. They were biological repositories holding the unread signatures of the city's worst predators. When she initiated a comprehensive audit of the department's cold case inventory from the pre-digital era, her attention was immediately drawn to Box 94 to 1108, the vanishing of Sarah Pendleton. The file attracted her clinical eye not because of the sensationalized high society reporting that had dominated the mid-90s, but because the primary piece of physical evidence, the emerald green wool coat, had been recovered from a freezing, near-sterile winter environment and immediately sealed into a heavy, high-density polyethylene evidence sleeve. While seasonal humidity and temperature fluctuations in the old police basements had ruined thousands of blood samples and latent print lifts over the decades, the thick wool of Sarah's coat had acted as a natural protective matrix, shielding any trapped organic material from the destructive effects of atmospheric oxidation and microbial decay. On January 12, 2026, the emerald coat was pulled from its 32-year confinement and placed beneath the laminar flow hood of the unit's main cleanroom, an environment where the air was filtered down to the microscopic particle and the technicians wore pressurized, full-body anti-contamination suits. The original laboratory teams of 1994 had utilized primitive, aggressive swabbing techniques, rubbing dry cotton tips across the surface of the fabric in a clumsy attempt to harvest blood or semen types, completely missing the microscopic trace evidence embedded deep within the mechanical structure of the garment's hardware. Dr. Thorne did not use swabs. She deployed a specialized, vacuum-assisted trace evidence retrieval system known as the MVAC, a device that sprays a sterile, pressurized chemical solution onto the fabric while simultaneously applying a high-velocity microvacuum to pull liquid and microscopic particles out of the deepest recesses of the textile weave. She focused the extraction nozzle not on the flat wool panels, but on the high-friction structural zones of the coat, the interior cuffs, the collar line, and most critically, the heavy, rusted teeth of the internal brass zipper that ran from the waist to the throat. It was a zone where an abductor, fighting to control a chemically paralyzed victim in the middle of a winter storm, would have been forced to apply massive, ungloved physical force to manipulate the hardware. The liquid harvested by the microvacuum was a murky, yellow-tinted solution containing 32 years of accumulated urban dust, wool fibers, and microscopic organic debris. Dr. Thorne ran the fluid through a high-efficiency multi-stage microfiltration system, concentrating the solid materials onto a specialized polyether sulfone membrane until a tiny, near-invisible residue of cellular material remained trapped on the surface. Under a high-magnification digital microscope, Thorne's hands remained perfectly steady as she adjusted the focus, her eyes narrowing as the screen displayed a single, pristine follicle of human hair, complete with an intact root structure, wedged deep within the oxidized brass tines of the zipper slider. The extraction of DNA from a vintage hair root that has been frozen, soaked, and buried in a basement for over 3 decades is an operation of immense technical peril. The historic molecules are typically highly fragmented, broken down by time into short, erratic chains that traditional forensic sequencing machines read as meaningless biological noise. Thorne utilized an advanced, whole genome amplification protocol known as single primer isothermal amplification, a technique that can take a highly compromised, microscopic sample of DNA and create millions of perfect, high-fidelity digital replicas without introducing artificial mutations into the sequence. For 96 hours, the laboratory's multi-capillary genetic sequencers worked continuously, utilizing high-intensity laser sensors to read the base pair configurations of the mysterious hair follicle. When the final computational readout was generated on Thorne's terminal, it didn't present a standard Cody's short tandem repeat profile, which looks at only 20 specific locations on the genome and is entirely useless if the killer has never been fingerprinted or booked into a local precinct. Instead, the sequence delivered a comprehensive single nucleotide polymorphism profile, mapping over 650,000 individual variations across the entire architecture of the suspect's genetic identity. The profile was a historical masterpiece, a high-definition, digital blueprint of a killer that included physical trait predictions, indicating a male individual of Northern European ancestry, with striking blue eyes, a high probability of early-onset male pattern silvering of the hair, and a highly specific regional ancestral lineage rooted deep in the pre-revolutionary families of the New England coast. Thorne uploaded this digital sequence into GEDmatch and FamilyTreeDNA, the massive, public-facing consumer databases where millions of ordinary civilians had voluntarily deposited their genetic maps to uncover their family histories or find long-lost cousins. The algorithms of the database didn't look for an exact criminal match. They scanned the vast digital ocean of civilian data to find long, contiguous blocks of matching chromosomes that indicated a shared ancestor. Within 4 minutes of the upload, the screen in the war room lit up with a constellation of genetic matches, none of them direct hits, but rather a tight, mathematical network of distant relatives scattered across the country. The strongest correlation belonged to a 58-year-old retired Episcopal minister living in visual obscurity in Burlington, Vermont, named Charles Vance. The system calculated that Charles shared approximately 6.8% of his genomic structure with the unidentified Boston abductor, a biological proximity that placed him precisely in the category of a first cousin once removed. To a traditional homicide detective, a first cousin in Vermont might look like another dead end in a 32-year-old maze, but to the genetic genealogists of the unit, it was the first anchor point of a web that could be spun backward to catch a king. Dr. Thorne brought in a team of specialized forensic genealogists who spent the next 3 weeks building Charles Vance's family tree backward to the late 19th century, utilizing digital birth certificates, old Harvard alumni registries, maritime shipping manifests, and probate court records from the Suffolk County Archives. They traced the lineage back to a single, historic patriarch, Harrison Vance, a 19th-century textile baron whose immense wealth had established the family's presence on Beacon Hill in the 1880s. Harrison had 2 sons, both of whom inherited vast corporate empires and produced a line of male descendants who occupied the highest strata of Boston's financial and political life throughout the 20th century. Branch by branch, leaf by leaf, Dr. Thorne's team systematically pruned the family tree of its biological impossibilities, eliminating male relatives who were dead, out of the country, or physically incapacitated in December 1994. By the first week of February 2026, the mathematical crosshairs of the genealogical algorithm had completed their contraction, bypassing the low-income branches of the family, bypassing the distant relatives in the Midwest, and converging with absolute, terrifying precision on a single, living individual who occupied the highest pinnacle of New England's high society. The digital terminal displayed a single name at the end of the computational pipeline: Julian Vance. The reaction within the high command of the Boston Police Department to this automated verdict was a state of immediate, cold panic. The chief of homicide sat in Dr. Thorne's office with the blinds drawn tightly, his face pale as he looked at the massive digital display that linked the hair follicle found in Sarah Pendleton's zipper straight to the boardroom of Vance Global Enterprises. This wasn't just a suspect. This was the man who had funded the department's new regional communication center, the man who regularly sat at charity dinners with the state's governor and whose multi-million-dollar foundations held the financial keys to half the cultural institutions in the city. If we move against Julian Vance with a genealogical probability, his legal team will have our badges before the ink on the warrant is dry, the chief whispered, his hand shaking slightly as he closed the file. We need more than a family tree. We need a direct, current, physical match obtained from his own body without his attorneys ever knowing we are breathing his air. The directive from the state prosecutor's office was an unyielding command, absolute operational secrecy. The unit was ordered to transition from analytical data processing to an active, deep-cover surveillance operation, deploying a team of specialized undercover operatives to track the billionaire philanthropist through his daily, high-society routine, waiting for the single, human moment of carelessness where the Saint of Boston would leave a trace of his current genetic code behind him in the public world. The digital noose was perfectly braided, but the monster was still sitting in his tower overlooking the public garden, completely unaware that the ancient fibers of an emerald coat had finally broken their silence to pull down his empire. The atmosphere within the financial district of Boston during the second week of February 2026 was crisp, clear, and bitingly cold. Under a pale winter sky, the city moved with its characteristic New England efficiency, business executives in heavy wool overcoats hurrying across Post Office Square, historical trolleys clattering down Tremont Street, and the great bronze bells of King's Chapel marking the hours over the busy sidewalks below. To the millions of citizens going about their daily lives, the city was a picture of modern prosperity and historic order. But beneath this surface of high-powered commerce and cultural prestige, a silent, deeply classified counter-operation was unfolding. A specialized surveillance team from the Massachusetts State Police, operating in coordination with the Forensic Genetic Intelligence Unit, had established a rolling perimeter around the 50-story granite obelisk that served as the global headquarters of Vance Global Enterprises. The operation was commanded by Detective Lieutenant Robert Vance, a veteran tactical investigator who, despite sharing a surname with the target through some distant, ancestral coincidence, felt nothing but a cold, clinical determination to dismantle the billionaire's empire. Robert had spent 20 years in deep-cover narcotics and counterterrorism units, tracking sophisticated international money launderers and high-level cartel operatives who used every cutting-edge technological tool available to mask their movements. He understood the delicate art of the invisible stakeout, the precise science of dissolving a multi-vehicle surveillance team into the background of a target's high-profile routine. Yet, as he sat in the rear of a nondescript, dark gray utility van parked near the corner of State Street, his eyes fixed on the building's private subterranean garage exit, he felt a level of professional anxiety that he hadn't experienced in a decade. The operational directives from the state attorney general were uncompromisingly strict, absolute passive infiltration. The surveillance team was explicitly forbidden from utilizing any traditional investigative methods that might trigger Julian Vance's highly refined survival instincts. They could not wiretap his private corporate servers, they could not request financial disclosures from his banks, and they could not attempt a standard trash pull from his multi-million-dollar maritime estate in Marblehead, as his private security apparatus, composed entirely of former federal agents and elite military contractors, monitored his residential perimeter with thermal imaging cameras and facial recognition software. A single operational anomaly, a strange vehicle idling too long near his private lane, a utility worker asking specific questions about the building's service schedules, would be detected instantly by his security detail, allowing his team of high-priced corporate defense attorneys to shield him before a single forensic test could be finalized. The entire mission depended on a single, high-stakes objective, obtaining a fresh sample of Julian Vance's biological material without his knowledge. For the first 5 days of the operation, the surveillance log read like a manual of pristine civic virtue and unassailable high society leadership. At exactly 7:15 a.m. every morning, Vance's armored black limousine would emerge from the underground garage of his Beacon Hill penthouse, gliding through the historic streets with a quiet, mechanical dignity. The billionaire sat in the rear cabin, his silver hair neatly styled, his eyes focused on a high-definition tablet as he reviewed international shipping logs, philanthropic endowments, and the latest quarterly reports for his medical research foundations. Robert watched him through a stabilized 600mm telephoto lens from the rear of the utility van, analyzing his movements with behavioral intensity. Vance moved with an effortless, aristocratic grace that belied his age, his posture straight, his expressions radiating a calm, authoritative intellect. There was no visible sign of a fractured psyche, no nervous scanning of his surroundings, no physical anomalies that suggested a man who carried the memories of 7 young women suffocating in the dark. He looked like an institution in human form, a realization that filled the surveillance van with a deep, professional discomfort. At 9 a.m., Vance would begin his corporate and charitable rounds, his movements meticulously scheduled by a team of 3 executive assistants who managed his life with military precision. The surveillance team followed him using a rotating grid of 6 vehicles, ordinary delivery trucks, hybrid sedans, and bicycles, ensuring that no single plate appeared twice in his rearview mirrors. They watched him lead boardroom meetings at his global headquarters, host luncheons for international charity directors at the Union Club, and tour the pediatric neurology wards at the hospital that bore his family name. The undercover team had installed directional laser microphones on adjacent rooftops, allowing them to capture the ambient audio of his public interactions. They listened to his voice, a warm, deeply reassuring baritone that possessed a natural, comforting authority, as he consoled the parents of sick children, promised multi-million-dollar grants to medical researchers, and laughed with city officials over corporate development strategies. It was a flawless, lifelong performance of benevolence, a masterclass in civic camouflage that had successfully blinded the entire Commonwealth for over 3 decades. The fundamental difficulty for the surveillance team lay in Vance's hypervigilant personal hygiene habits, which functioned as a near-impenetrable barrier against trace evidence harvesting. He was a man obsessed with cleanliness, a trait that Dr. Thornback in the laboratory began to categorize not merely as a personal eccentricity, but as a deeply ingrained forensic countermeasure developed over a lifetime of secret pathology. When he attended corporate luncheons, he never used the standard hotel or restaurant glassware. His personal security detail carried a specialized, velvet-lined case containing his private crystal tumbler and silver utensils, which were immediately wiped down with antibacterial solution and secured by his guards the moment he finished eating. When he signed corporate contracts or philanthropic deeds, he used a custom-designed fountain pen that he personally returned to his breast pocket. Even his trash at his office was subjected to a rigorous destruction protocol. All contents from his private office bins were collected twice daily by a trusted, long-term security chief and fed directly into an industrial shredder and chemical digester located within the building's secure core. He left nothing behind. He gave no genetic quarter to the world around him. The critical break in the case occurred on Friday, February 13th, a day that began with a massive, sudden shift in the regional weather patterns as a fast-moving, low-pressure system from Canada dropped the temperature across Boston by 30 degrees in a matter of hours, bringing with it a blinding, high-velocity squall of freezing sleet and heavy winter fog. At 1:30 p.m., Vance's schedule listed a private, non-publicized engagement away from his corporate headquarters, a personal trip to an exclusive, historic gentlemen's club located on the northern coast of the Commonwealth, near the rocky cliffs of Manchester by the Sea. The silver limousine pulled out of the parking structure, its tires slicing through the slush as it accelerated onto the interstate, moving north away from the city center. Robert Vance's surveillance vehicles fell into a wide, extended trailing formation, keeping the target just within visual range of their high-definition forward cameras as the visibility plummeted into a dense, gray wall of coastal mist. The vehicle turned down a narrow, private peninsula road lined with ancient, wind-stunted pine trees, arriving at the perimeter of the St. Jude Maritime Society, a highly restrictive, century-old private club where New England's old money elite gathered to discuss yachting, global shipping, and ancestral investments far away from the prying eyes of the media or the public. The main clubhouse was a massive, shingle-style mansion that sat on the very edge of a jagged granite cliff, its windows looking out over the churning, black waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The property was heavily guarded, featuring a private gatehouse staffed by security personnel who checked the credentials of every entering vehicle against a strict, pre-approved membership manifest. Robert's utility van was forced to pull over onto the shoulder of the main highway, half a mile away, its monitors displaying a dead zone of coverage as the billionaire's limousine vanished behind the heavy iron gates. "We're locked out," Detective Ramirez said, slamming his hand against the console of the surveillance van. "The gatehouse won't let any vehicle past without a membership token or an executive invite. If he stays in that compound for the weekend, he could destroy whatever trace evidence he's currently carrying before we ever get close." Robert Vance sat perfectly still in the dim warmth of the van, his eyes fixed on the satellite mapping of the peninsula. He noted a narrow, public beach access path that terminated at the base of the granite cliffs just below the eastern terrace of the clubhouse, a rugged, treacherous trail used primarily by local lobster fishermen and winter surfers. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, the wind howling off the ocean at 40 knots, throwing heavy sheets of freezing salt spray across the rocks. "We don't take a car," Robert said, his voice dropping into a low, decisive tone as he reached for a heavy, water-resistant canvas jacket. "We go in on foot from the beach." Ramirez grabbed the digital audio array and the biological collection kit. "We dress like local marine technicians, checking the offshore weather buoy lines. If anyone stops us on the rocks, we tell them the storm pulled the telemetry cables loose." The two detectives stepped out into the brutal coastal gale, their boots slipping on the ice-covered seaweed as they fought their way along the base of the cliffs, the black ocean waves crashing against the granite just inches from their feet. The air tasted of salt, cold oil, and frozen mud. After 20 minutes of an exhausting physical climb through the freezing spray, they reached a recessed stone stairway that wound up the side of the cliff, terminating at the edge of the clubhouse's private outdoor smoking terrace, a wide, slate-paved deck that sat directly off the main library bar. The terrace was completely deserted, the brutal winter weather having driven the wealthy members deep into the interior warmth of the building, where a massive stone fireplace threw a warm, amber glow through the high leaded glass windows. Robert and Ramirez positioned themselves in a deep, shadowed alcove behind a massive decorative stone urn, their bodies shivering from the cold as they peered through the frost-rimed glass into the opulent interior of the library. The room was the epitome of New England privilege: low-slung leather sofas, oil paintings of 19th-century clipper ships, and walls lined with thousands of rare, gold-leaf volumes of history and law. In the furthest corner of the room, sitting alone in a high-backed wing chair near a window that looked out over the sea, was Julian Vance. He had removed his heavy overcoat, revealing a dark navy cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, his posture slouched in a way that the public had never been allowed to see. The pristine, dynamic energy he projected at his corporate galas was entirely absent, replaced by a heavy, sullen exhaustion that made his face look hard, lined, and deeply predatory in the dim light of the library bar. He was staring out at the black ocean, his hands holding a crystal tumbler of neat scotch, his fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic, almost mechanical pattern against the arm of the chair. He was alone in the room, the other members of the club having gathered in the main dining hall at the opposite end of the complex for the afternoon business address. A young bartender stood at the far end of the long mahogany bar, his back turned as he polished silver trays, completely oblivious to the man in the corner. Vance took a slow, deep sip of the liquor, setting the glass down on a small brass table beside him. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that caused Robert's pulse to spike violently against his ribs, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, the private, hidden vice that he kept strictly concealed from his public relations teams and the medical foundations that printed his warnings against corporate tobacco. He pulled a single, white cylinder from the pack, a standard, high-grade European cigarette, and struck a gold match, bringing the flame to the tip. He inhaled deeply, his chest expanding as the smoke filled his lungs, his face relaxing into an expression of profound, defiant satisfaction. He sat there for 10 minutes in the shadows of the library corner, a billionaire predator smoking alone in his fortress, completely unaware that just 5 feet away, on the other side of the freezing glass, 2 state detectives were watching his lips through an electronic night vision scope that captured every microscopic movement of his face. Vance smoked the cigarette down until the ash grew long, his saliva soaking into the paper filter with every measured drag, depositing millions of fresh, intact epithelial cells containing the complete, uncompromised genomic sequence of his identity. He did not use the heavy crystal ashtray on the table. Instead, with a casual, careless movement that defined his absolute sense of property and privilege, he stepped out through the small side door onto the freezing terrace, wanting to feel the cold wind against his skin for a brief second before returning to his dinner. He took a final, deep draw of the smoke, dropped the half-burnt cylinder onto the slate tiles of the deck, and crushed the ember beneath the heel of his bespoke leather shoe before stepping back inside and sliding the bolt locked behind him. The moment the brass latch clicked into place inside the room, Robert Vance moved out from behind the stone urn like a shadow. He didn't use tweezers or standard evidence bags that might catch the wind and blow away into the ocean. He dropped his knees on the freezing slate, his gloved hands shielding the small, crushed piece of paper from the driving sleet. Using a sterile, vacuum-sealed collection tube designed for high-velocity field genetics, he harvested the wet, flattened cigarette filter from the tile, twisting the airtight cap until it locked with a sharp, definitive click that broke the roar of the coastal storm. He looked down through the clear plastic of the tube at the brown-stained paper, seeing the distinct, damp mark where the billionaire's mouth had touched the filter just seconds before, a pristine, high-molecular-weight biological time capsule that would dismantle 32 years of high-society deception within 48 hours. He slipped the tube into his inner breast pocket, locked eyes with Ramirez, and gave a single, silent nod. The long watch on Beacon Hill was officially over. The molecular execution was about to begin. The transition from absolute social supremacy to raw, concrete-grounded physical reality took less than 45 seconds. Tuesday, February 17, 2026, broke over the financial district of Boston with a razor-sharp, crystalline coldness, the coastal fog from the previous evening having vanished to leave a sky that was a deep, brilliant indigo. At 8:45 a.m., the towering granite and glass obelisk that served as the global headquarters of Vance Global Enterprises was operating with the flawless, silent efficiency of a multi-billion-dollar empire. High-backed leather chairs were wheeled into executive boardrooms. Private couriers in crisp uniforms delivered international customs manifests to the administrative desks, and in the grand marble lobby, the elite of the city's financial world moved across the polished stone floors with the quiet confidence of unchecked privilege. It was a cathedral of modern commerce, built by a man who had successfully integrated his private sadism into the very structural fabric of the Commonwealth's economy. At exactly 8:54 a.m., 3 heavy black utility vans, entirely devoid of municipal markings or state law enforcement insignia, glided into the commercial loading zone directly opposite the main entrance of the Vance Tower. They did not activate sirens, they did not flash emergency light bars, and they did not deploy the high-visibility tactical assets that typically announce a high-stakes felony intervention. Instead, 8 men and women dressed in ordinary civilian business attire, heavy wool overcoats, dark slacks, and leather gloves, stepped out of the vehicles, their hands tucked casually into their pockets as they dispersed into a wide, tactical semicircle across the plaza of Post Office Square. To the private corporate security guards monitoring the exterior high-definition cameras from their subterranean control room, they looked like standard federal corporate compliance auditors arriving for a routine regulatory review. But beneath those loose-fitting cashmere and wool coats, the heavy ceramic plates of body armor sat tight against their ribs, and their fingers were resting inches from the grips of their concealed, high-velocity automatic service weapons. Lieutenant Robert Vance led the line, his stride measured, calm, and deliberate, his eyes locked onto the massive, revolving brass doors of the tower's main pavilion. He carried the folded parchment of the capital murder arrest warrant in his left breast pocket, right against his heart, feeling the heavy paper shift against his armor with every step. He had spent 48 hours mentally preparing for this exact moment, calculating the psychological breaking points of a man who had spent 32 years believing he had successfully rewritten the history of his own atrocities. He knew that Julian Vance would not view this intervention as a traditional legal action, but as an impossible, blasphemous disruption of his private universe. The objective was to execute the takedown before the billionaire's high-priced executive security detail could realize they were dealing with a state warrant rather than a civilian security anomaly. At precisely 9:01 a.m., the revolving brass doors spun with a slow, heavy dignity, and Julian Vance stepped out onto the wide marble plaza. He was dressed in a pristine, tailored charcoal pinstripe suit, his silver hair catching the brilliant winter sun like spun aluminum, a bespoke leather document case held flat against his palm. He stopped for a split second on the top step, turning his face toward the cold harbor breeze, his expression wearing that familiar, serene patrician confidence that had dominated the charitable boardrooms of New England for a generation. He turned to say a final word to his executive vice president, a prominent state banking trustee who was walking beside him, his voice low, resonant, and entirely comfortable. He was a king walking through his courtyard, surrounded by the physical monuments he had built with the money generated from the very city he had spent decades systematically preying upon. Julian Vance, Robert's voice cut through the ambient murmur of the morning corporate commute like a heavy piece of iron falling onto glass, not a shout, but a cold, authoritative command that caused the bank trustee to freeze instantly on the step. Vance stopped on the third marble step, his head turning with a slow, aristocratic deliberation toward the source of the interruption. His piercing blue eyes scanned the group of plainclothes state detectives as they closed their semicircle around the base of the stairs, effectively sealing off his path toward his waiting luxury limousine and blocking the entrance back into the corporate pavilion. The smile did not immediately leave the billionaire's face. It merely ossified, transforming into a mask of polite, slightly cold condescension, the look of a busy titan of industry who is being delayed by an administrative oversight. "Good morning, gentlemen." Vance's magnificent, soothing baritone boomed across the concrete plaza, filling the space with its natural, comforting authority. "If you are with the Municipal Development Committee, you are well aware that my schedule does not allow for impromptu street briefings. Speak with my executive assistant on the 45th floor, and she will allocate a proper time for us to sit down next month." He made a sharp, decisive movement to step past them, his leather document case shifting under his arm, but Lieutenant Robert Vance stepped forward, climbing the first 2 marble stairs until he was standing just 18 inches away, looking straight into the cold, ancient eyes of the patrician. Robert reached into his heavy wool coat, pulled out the gold and enamel shield of the Massachusetts State Police, and held it rock-steady in the winter light. "Julian Vance, I am Lieutenant Robert Vance with the State Forensic Genetic Intelligence Unit," Robert said, his voice dropping into a low, deadly serious register that caused the billionaire's posture to lock instantly into absolute rigidity. "I have a warrant issued by the Supreme Judicial Court of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for your immediate arrest on the charge of capital murder. Specifically, for the December 14, 1994, abduction and homicide of Sarah Elizabeth Pendleton." The words dropped into the center of the crowded plaza with the shattering weight of a kinetic strike, detonating a psychological vacuum that seemed to instantly freeze the morning routine of the entire financial district. The bank trustee let go of his leather briefcase, the metal corner clattering loudly against the granite steps. A young corporate paralegal who had just stepped out of the coffee shop dropped her cup, the hot liquid spreading across the gray concrete like oil. The name Sarah Elizabeth Pendleton had not been spoken aloud in this district since the final snows of 1994, and its sudden, uncompromised resurrection on the steps of the Vance Tower broke the 32-year illusion of the billionaire's immunity with a violent, terrifying force. The physical transformation that occurred in Julian Vance's face during those 3 seconds of legal delivery was a sight that the arresting officers would later describe in their internal briefings as an encounter with a different biological species. The benevolent, soft-spoken public patriarch vanished instantly, the delicate muscles around his mouth hardening into a grimace of absolute, venomous hatred. His eyes did not widen with panic or pale with the fear of an old man caught in a net. Instead, his pupils contracted into tiny black pins, his gaze shifting from an executive scanning a crowd to an apex predator calculating the structural integrity of a cage. His jaw locked with a violent, visible spasm that caused the silver veins along his temples to pulse dark against his skin. "This is an absurd, treasonous piece of theater," Vance whispered, his voice losing its warm, booming resonance, replaced by a low, vibrating hiss that was captured with absolute clarity by the tactical microphones hidden beneath Robert's collar. "This is a malicious, politically motivated slander designed to extort my foundations and disrupt the commercial stability of this city. I built the very infrastructure you are standing on. I funded the communications network your department uses to coordinate its patrols. You have no jurisdiction on these stones." He made a sudden, explosive movement to turn back toward the heavy glass revolving doors, his arm reaching out to push past the trustee, but Detective Ramirez and a second tactical officer moved with the synchronized speed of trained greyhounds. They lunged up the marble steps, catching the billionaire by his silk-lined sleeves and driving his body flat against the massive granite support column of the tower pavilion before his private executive guards could even clear their holsters from behind the reception desk. The bespoke leather document case fell from his fingers, bursting open against the edge of the stair and spilling international maritime shipping contracts, private foundation registries, and a collection of handwritten notes into the dirty winter slush. "Get your hands off me, you back alley thugs," Vance roared, his voice cracking into a raw, guttural register that sounded completely divorced from the gentle shepherd of Boston's high culture. "Do you have any conception of who I am? I will have your administrative headers by noon. I will see your families bankrupted and your names dragged through the dirt of every court in this country." He began to thrash against the grip of the detectives with a surprising, athletic ferocity, his custom-tailored suit jacket tearing at the armpits as he used his long arms and heavy shoulders to fight the restraint, his face turning a dark, dangerous crimson as the pristine veneer of the patrician was ripped away to reveal the raw, jagged edges of his true pathology. For 30 chaotic seconds, the premier philanthropist of New England was nothing more than a desperate, violent suspect wrestling with state police on a set of public stairs, his silver hair falling across his eyes, his breath coming in hot, desperate gasps against the cold granite column. "Stop fighting, Julian," Robert Vance shouted over the rising roar of the gathered crowd, his hand clamping around the billionaire's right wrist with a bone-crushing leverage that forced the limb behind his back until the first loop of the steel handcuffs clicked locked into the skin. "It's over. The DNA harvested from the coastal terrace in Manchester matches the follicle trapped in Sarah Pendleton's zipper slider. The mathematics have caught up to you. Your own blood has signed the ledger." The moment the word DNA collided with his consciousness, Julian Vance's entire physical structure went completely flaccid, the kinetic resistance draining out of his muscles instantly as if a breaker switch had been thrown in his central nervous system. He stopped shouting, he stopped twisting, his forehead resting flat against the freezing gray granite of his own corporate monument, his eyes fixed on the spilled sheets of paper that were currently absorbing the black slush of the plaza. The scientific mention of the genomic match was the ultimate verbal silver bullet. It stripped away his ability to claim an administrative conspiracy. It rendered his high-priced legal defense useless before it could even enter a courtroom, and it forced him to realize that the phantom he thought he had buried 12 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean 3 decades ago had finally returned to drag him down into the dirt. Ramirez pulled the billionaire's left wrist back, securing the second cuff with a sharp, heavy click that broke the silence of the plaza once again. The patrician king of Beacon Hill was in chains. As they turned him around to guide him down the marble steps toward the open rear doors of the lead utility van, the full scale of the structural collapse became visible. Hundreds of corporate attorneys, stockbrokers, and administrative clerks had rushed to the high glass windows of the surrounding towers, staring down at the scene in a state of collective, paralyzed disbelief. The man who had been the very symbol of New England's moral and financial vanity was being led away like a common thief, his head bowed, his hands bound behind his back, his expensive pinstripe suit stained with the wet grime of the public steps, while the digital networks of the state flashed the unalterable headline to every corner of the globe: Boston 1994 cold case solved. Billionaire philanthropist exposed as serial killer. The mechanical transition from the sunlit plaza of Post Office Square to the windowless, soundproof environment of Interview Room Alpha at the Suffolk County High Security Facility took exactly 12 minutes of high-velocity transit. Inside this subterranean cell, the architecture of immense wealth and generational privilege ceased to exist. There were no obsidian desks, no 19th-century oil paintings of clipper ships, and no panoramic views of the Boston Public Garden to soften the psychological impact of the setting. The room was a concrete block cube painted a dull, institutional gray, containing a single reinforced steel table bolted directly into the concrete floor, 3 hard plastic chairs, and a massive, one-way mirror that dominated the eastern wall. Behind that glass sat a silent team of behavioral analysts, state prosecutors, and the Attorney General himself, their eyes fixed on the man who had dictated the social ledger of New England for over 3 decades. Julian Vance sat in the center chair, his hands handcuffed behind his back, his tailored charcoal pinstripe suit jacket removed to reveal the damp, sweat-stained linen of his custom dress shirt. The silver hair that had looked so majestic under the chandeliers of the Copley Plaza Hotel was now frayed and unkempt, clinging to his forehead in thin, wet streaks that made his face look hard, angular, and deeply clinical. For the first 2 hours of his confinement, he had maintained a rigid, theatrical silence, his eyes fixed on the blank gray wall ahead of him, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, measured cadence that looked like meditation, but felt to the watching profilers like a continuous, frantic rehearsal of a legal counter-strategy. Lieutenant Robert Vance walked into the room at precisely 11:30 a.m., carrying a single, heavy blue cardboard accordion folder containing the complete physical and digital legacy of December 14, 1994. He did not drop the file onto the table with a theatrical slam. He placed it down with a slow, deliberate neatness, pulling out his chair and sitting directly opposite the billionaire with his gloved hands flat against the steel surface. Robert didn't turn on a portable recording device, as the high-fidelity studio microphones embedded in the ceiling were already streaming the audio directly to an encrypted state server. "Julian," Robert began, his voice flat, conversational, and completely stripped of the corporate or social titles that the suspect had used as armor for a lifetime. "The trading boards have already suspended volume on Vance Global stock. Your corporate board of directors issued a statement 10 minutes ago distancing themselves from your personal foundations, and your legal team is currently upstairs arguing with a federal magistrate about asset freezes. The fortress has crumbled. It's just you, me, and the table." Vance did not immediately shift his gaze from the wall, his jaw tightening until the heavy muscles at the base of his ears pulsed beneath his skin. When he finally turned his head to look at the detective, his piercing blue eyes were completely clear, devoid of the soft, benevolent warmth he usually wore like a mask, replaced instead by a cold, calculating intensity that looked for a psychological weakness in Robert's demeanor. "You speak of fortresses and trading boards, Lieutenant, because your mind is entirely confined by the small, petty metrics of bureaucratic life," Vance said, his magnificent baritone remarkably steady despite the hours of isolation, filling the concrete box with its natural, vibrating resonance. "You think you have captured a criminal. You don't possess the intellectual capacity to realize that you are merely interrupting a larger, structural work. This warrant is an administrative farce, a collection of statistical anomalies and contaminated trace theories designed by desperate politicians to extort the city's most visible benefactor." Robert didn't blink. He reached into the blue folder, pulling out a series of high-contrast, glossy forensic photographs from 1994 and laying them out across the steel table like a deck of cards. The first image was a stark, close-up shot of Sarah Pendleton's emerald green wool coat as it lay neatly folded on the park bench overlooking the frozen Charles River Basin, the fabric stiff with ice and salt spray. The second was a high-magnification macro photograph of the rusted internal brass teeth of the coat's zipper slider, highlighting the microscopic follicle of human hair that Dr. Thorne had vacuumed out of the metal hardware. "Let's look at the metrics, Julian," Robert said, his finger resting flat against the edge of the second photo. "This isn't an administrative farce. This is a hair follicle from your head, left deep inside the teeth of the zipper slider when you pulled it up to seal her coat after you chemically paralyzed her in Mount Vernon Square. You didn't do it for money. You didn't do it because she knew a corporate secret. You did it because your immense fortune had bored you to the point of psychological stagnation, and you wanted to feel the absolute, godlike authority of watching a human identity completely dissolve into nothingness under your hands." Vance's eyes dropped to the photographs for a fraction of a second, his pupils dilating as his brain processed the physical reality of the evidence he had spent 32 years believing was buried forever in the deep ocean trenches off the coast of New Hampshire. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his posture. His shoulders dropped back slightly, his chest expanding as he took a deep, steadying breath, his face settling into a mask of serene, stoic detachment that behavioral profilers categorize as the ultimate defense mechanism of a clinical psychopath. "I have funded the very forensic laboratories that generated these images, young man," Vance murmured, his tone softening into that gentle, sorrowful cadence he usually reserved for his hospital dedication speeches. "I spent millions of dollars establishing the Vance Center for Genomic Sciences because I believe in the precision of truth. If you think that a single, unverified hair follicle found in a public park 32 years ago can outweigh a lifetime of monumentally visible benevolence, you are failing the basic rules of civic architecture. I sat on the charity boards that comforted the city's families. I am not a butcher." "We are past the charity board performance, Julian," Robert interrupted, his voice cutting through the patrician delivery with a cold, administrative finality. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the folder. The genomic verifier report generated 24 hours prior by the forensic unit. "This isn't a circumstantial trace theory anymore. This is an absolute identity match. We tracked you to the coastal terrace of the St. Jude Maritime Society last Friday. We watched you order a double shot of scotch, and we watched you smoke an imported cigarette. We harvested that cigarette filter out of the deck tiles the moment you stepped back inside the library." Robert slid the high-density SNP mapping chart across the steel table, his pen pointing to the identical columns of digitized base pair sequences. "The DNA extracted from your fresh saliva on that terrace matches the DNA extracted from the hair root trapped in Sarah Pendleton's zipper slider with a statistical certainty of 1 in 92 quadrillion," Robert stated, the numbers falling into the small concrete room like heavy pieces of lead. "That means there is no room for a defense expert to talk about contamination, there is no room to blame a phantom drifter from South Station, and there is no room to run to your private jet. Your own mouth touched the paper that signed your execution order." The silence that followed this statement was absolute, a suffocating, pressurized vacuum that lasted for nearly 2 minutes. The benevolent, soft-spoken public patriarch, the multi-billion-dollar saint of New England, didn't just crack. He vanished completely, evaporating beneath the heat of the mathematical certainty laid out on the table before him. Vance stared at the genomic columns, his mouth opening slightly as his breathing became rapid, shallow, and irregular, his nostrils flaring as the survival instincts of an unmasked predator began to misfire inside his brain. Behind the one-way mirror, the behavioral analysts leaned forward, watching the physical dissolution of an idol. Vance's head dropped slightly, his silver hair falling forward to cover his eyes as a low, trembling vibration began at the base of his neck and moved through his shoulders. For a moment, it looked as if he were about to break into a performance of profound, historic repentance that could be used by his high-priced legal team to angle for a plea bargain or a life sentence in a comfortable medical facility. But when he finally raised his face back up to look at Robert, there were no tears in his piercing blue eyes. Instead, his mouth twisted into a slow, terrifying smile, a cynical, arrogant expression of pure, unadulterated vanity that had nothing to do with the church, the corporations, or the city, and everything to do with the dark, hidden thrill of a secret that had finally outgrown its cage. The voice that came out of his throat wasn't the warm, comforting baritone of his public speeches. It was a dry, gravelly, monotone whisper that chilled the recording technicians in the sound booth to the bone. 1 in 92 quadrillion, Vance muttered, his long fingers twitching slightly within the steel loops of the handcuffs behind his back. You think you have defeated me with an equation, Lieutenant. You think you have solved a mystery. You don't possess the vision to understand that the equation doesn't alter what I accomplished. It doesn't change the fact that for 32 years, every politician, every judge, and every institution in this Commonwealth operated under the umbrella of my permission. I didn't just escape your laws. I used your laws as the mortar for my palace. He leaned forward across the steel table, his face just inches from Robert's, the scent of the roadhouse tobacco and expensive scotch still clinging faintly to his clothes. I didn't choose Sarah because she was an architect, Lieutenant, Vance whispered, his eyes widening with a cold, manic intensity that revealed the true, terrifying layout of his psychosis. She was simply a beautiful, vibrant shape moving through the freezing slush of Mount Vernon Square. I had been sitting in my car for an hour, looking out at the gas lamps, feeling this immense, boiling necessity in my chest that no corporate acquisition or charitable donation could ever satisfy. I had spent my entire life being the perfect heir, the pristine executive, the brilliant patriarch, while everyone around me was weak, desperate, and small. I wanted to see if I could step completely out of the moral universe, execute an act of absolute, sovereign destruction, and step back into the grand ballroom of the Copley Plaza without a single person ever seeing the shadow in my eyes. He paused, a short, dry chuckle rattling in his throat as his eyes scanned the photographs of the emerald coat with a chilling, nostalgic fondness. And it worked, he continued, his whisper growing sharper, more intense. I paralyzed her. I documented every fraction of her terror behind that utility wall on Brimmer Street, and then I steamed 12 miles out into the black Atlantic and dropped her into the dark. The next night, I stood before 500 of the state's most powerful leaders and raised $2 million to protect the city's youth. The more I preyed upon this city, the louder they cheered for my benevolence, and the higher they carved my name into the stone pediments of their hospitals. I used their grief as the engine for my social ascension. Every speech I ever delivered on civic virtue was a masterpiece of absolute truth, because I knew exactly what a monster looked like. He was the one cutting the checks for their children's beds, watching them weep while his hands were still carrying the micro-traces of their daughters' lives. Lieutenant Robert Vance sat perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment, though his fingers were pressed so tightly against the steel table his knuckles had turned entirely white. He had secured the confession. The studio microphones had captured every single syllable of the billionaire's self-indictment, a pristine, uncoerced recording that would ensure his permanent removal from society under the capital statutes of the Commonwealth. There would be no executive loopholes, no multi-year delays based on circumstantial evidence, and no political interventions from his old friends in the State House. The idol of Boston had spoken his own damnation into the record, providing the final, absolute confirmation that his entire empire of philanthropy had been nothing more than a lethal illusion curated by an apex predator. As Robert stood up to leave the room, closing the blue cardboard folder with a sharp, definitive snap, Julian Vance remained leaning forward across the steel table, his terrifying smile frozen under the glare of the fluorescent tubes, his eyes still fixed on the glossy photograph of the emerald coat. He had lost his freedom, he had lost his corporations, and he had lost his crown, but in his corrupted, narcissistic mind, he had won the ultimate victory over time itself. He had proven that a man could live as a monster in the historic heart of paradise for over 3 decades, using the very structures of society to hide the blood on his hands, leaving an entire city to sit forever amidst the smoking, ruined remains of a civic faith that had been weaponized against them from the very beginning. The architectural containment of a 32-year-old pathology requires a physical infrastructure far more sophisticated than a simple lock and key. When a predator operates at the multi-billion-dollar tier of global maritime commerce and real estate development, his hunting grounds and his storage facilities are inevitably woven directly into the concrete foundations of the city itself. On Wednesday, February 18th, 2026, less than 24 hours after Julian Vance's dramatic deposition on the marble steps of his corporate tower, a specialized structural recovery task force descended upon the Brimmer Street brownstone, the empty luxury property where the surveillance logs indicated the billionaire had spent the critical, unmonitored hours of December 14th, 1994. The operation was executed with a silent, industrialized intensity that completely bypassed the local municipal zoning boards and residential property associations of Beacon Hill. State troopers established a 3-block exclusion zone around the historic brick structure, erected high-density privacy shields across the wrought iron entryways, and deployed heavy, unmarked utility trucks packed with ground-penetrating radar arrays, concrete boring tools, and atmospheric chemical sniffers. The wealthy neighbors, wrapped in their heavy cashmere robes, peered through their double-paned windows in a state of muted, terrified anticipation. They were about to witness the forensic excavation of a structural vault that had sat directly beneath their feet while they discussed historical preservation and old money investments. Lieutenant Robert Vance walked through the arch service entrance of the basement at 8:30 a.m., accompanied by Dr. Clara Thorne and a team of 3 structural engineers from the Department of Public Safety. The air in the subterranean level was ice-cold, smelling of old cast-iron pipes, damp brick mortar, and the faint, sweet chemical aroma of the specialized industrial sealants Vance's construction companies utilized to waterproof deep foundations below the city's water table. The space was dominated by a massive, dual-stage commercial boiler system installed in the early 90s, its rusted copper conduits twisting across the ceiling like the hardened arteries of an ancient monster. The behavioral metrics collected during the interrogation indicate that he didn't just dump his history into the ocean, Dr. Thorne said, her voice echoing hollowly within the brick chamber as she adjusted her forensic headlamp. An offender driven by this level of systematic intellectual control requires a dedicated space to process his victories. He built this property under a private corporate shell in 1993, acting as his own general contractor. He spent 3 months working down here alone before the primary construction crews were permitted onto the upper floors. The engineers began their sweep using high-frequency electromagnetic radar units, rolling the digital sensors across the historic fieldstone and brick walls to map any internal void spaces or anomalous structural density variations. For 3 hours, the machines generated a continuous, blue-tinted cross-sectional map of the subterranean foundations, displaying nothing but solid granite blocks and reinforced concrete footings designed to hold the immense weight of the 5-story brownstone above. But as the radar array crossed the rear wall of the boiler enclosure, a seemingly solid expanse of 19th-century red brick directly behind the main water filtration tanks, the digital display monitor registered a sharp, geometrically perfect rectangular void measuring exactly 12 feet by 8 feet. The entry mechanism was not a crude mechanical latch or a hidden keyhole that could be detected by a physical search. It was integrated into the active utility infrastructure of the building itself. To initiate the structural release, a technician had to isolate the primary steam pressure valve on the boiler assembly, rotate the secondary water pressure while precisely 27 degrees past its standard safety detent, and apply a continuous electrical short circuit to a specific, dead-end breaker switch inside the main commercial power panel. The engineer executed the sequence, and with a heavy, pressurized hiss that sounded like a mechanical lung deflating, a massive 4-brick-thick section of the wall slid backward into a tracks assembly, revealing a heavy, industrial-grade vault door composed of low-carbon surgical steel. The vault door was equipped with a digital, 7-digit biometric keypad that had been retrofitted with modern electronic encryption chips to prevent remote cyber breaches. The state locksmiths bypassed the system utilizing a specialized high-voltage, localized electromagnetic pulse device, melting the internal solenoid pins until the heavy steel locking bolts retracted with a sharp, echoing metallic thud. Robert Vance threw his shoulder against the door, pushing the 600-pound barrier open to reveal a sterile, white-tiled chamber that looked less like a basement vault and more like a high-security research laboratory at a major medical institute. The room was maintained under a continuous, independent negative pressure ventilation system, its clean air filters preventing any trace scents or biological gases from ever escaping into the upper residential floors of the brownstone. In the center of the space sat a long, surgical-grade stainless steel examination table, equipped with adjustable leather restraint straps and flanked by an array of vintage 1990s medical monitoring gear, high-definition video recording rigs on articulated ceiling tracks, and an industrial chemical sink. This was the processing chamber, the secret, structural theater where Julian Vance had spent 32 years transforming his immense wealth into an instrument of absolute, unmonitored human destruction. He kept them here, Dr. Thorne whispered, her gloved hand trembling slightly as she illuminated the far wall of the vault, where a massive, climate-controlled commercial evidence repository sat flush within the white tilework. He didn't just abduct them. He kept them alive within this cage for days, processing their physiological collapse under experimental chemical conditions before he weighted them down and dropped them into the marine trenches. The commercial repository was unlocked using a hydraulic extraction tool, its heavy glass panel drawers sliding open with a low, chilling mechanical hum. Inside the felt-lined interior compartments lay an unshakable, systematic archive of New England's missing persons registry, a collection of 7 individual glass specimens jars, each holding a small, meticulously preserved physical trophy and labeled with a typed paper strip indicating a name, a date, a location, and a numerical index code that matched the chapters of the digital journals found on his corporate servers. The first drawer contained the small, tarnished silver charm bracelet that had been clipped from Sarah Pendleton's wrist before her coat was staged on the Charles River Boardwalk in December 1994. But behind her bracelet lay 6 other lives that had been completely erased from the face of the earth between 1988 and 2002, a gold signet ring from a Boston University student who had vanished from a Kenmore Square subway platform in October 1989, a silk hair ribbon from a young teller who had disappeared after leaving a financial office in downtown Crossing in May 1991, a pair of distinctive silver earrings from an art history major who had vanished from a gallery opening in Newberry Street. In April 1997, Vance had not been a random, regional killer who struck out of sudden, chaotic impulse. He was a highly calculated, multi-jurisdictional apex predator who used his private real estate developments and structural access to the city's historic buildings to construct an untraceable network of custom abattoirs. Every time he stood on the steps of the State House, presenting multi-million-dollar donations to the Commonwealth Safe Streets Initiative, he was utilizing the administrative data from those very programs to refine the security structures of the private torture chambers, where his victims were systematically dying. He built a museum for his ego, Robert Vance said, his voice hard, flat, and dripping with an absolute, administrative fury as he looked down at the neat rows of glass vials. He didn't just beat the law for 32 years. He used our entire legal and financial architecture to protect his display cases. Every check he ever signed for a hospital wing was just a line item in his budget to ensure that no city inspector would ever ask to check the blueprints of this basement. Dr. Thorne immediately mobilized the unit's portable forensic imaging arrays, utilizing high-intensity forensic light sources to scan the stainless steel table and the surrounding tilework for any latent biological traces that had survived 30 years of chemical bleaching. Under the short-wave ultraviolet light, the seemingly pristine steel table erupted into a brilliant, glowing topography of historical violence, countless microabrasions, chemical scrub patterns, and the distinct, luminescent outlines of human hands that had been pinned to the metal loops of the restraint tracks under the blinding glare of the surgical lights. Beneath the primary storage array, tucked inside a reinforced titanium document safe, the team recovered 32 black leather-bound ledger books, private, handwritten chronological logs that Vance had curated with the obsessive precision of a medical examiner. These weren't erratic, emotional accounts of a disorganized criminal mind. They were dense, analytical research records written in a complex, alphanumeric shorthand that detailed the precise physiological tolerances of the human respiratory system under specific chemical paralytics, the psychological phases of isolation terror experienced by his victims as they realized no one would ever hear their screams through the 4-foot concrete walls, and his own internal neurological responses as he held the wire ligatures in the dark. The acquisition of this underground archive completely transformed the operational nature of the prosecution, turning the upcoming trial of Julian Vance from a single local cold case resolution into a historic, multi-jurisdictional federal racketeering and serial murder indictment that would shatter the cultural and social elite of New England for generations to come. The state prosecutors realized that the billionaire's legal team, which had already initiated an aggressive media campaign to frame the arrest as a lawless government extortion plot, would have no room to move before a jury. The physical recovery of the victim's personal items, archived within an underground biometric vault built by Vance's own construction company inside a property owned by his private estate, was the absolute legal hammer. It was a flawless, physical chain of culpability that led straight from the dark history of the city's streets into the very heart of his private kingdom. As the forensic technicians began the slow, agonizing process of vacuum packing every individual item within the vault, sealing the glass specimen jars into armored evidence crates for transport back to the state laboratory, Lieutenant Robert Vance stepped back out into the freezing winter air of Brimmer Street. The sun was setting over the Charles River, casting a long, blood-red shadow across the brick row houses of Beacon Hill. The historic gas lamps were beginning to flicker to life along the sidewalks, their yellow glow illuminating a neighborhood that would never sleep with the same comfortable security again. The fortress of philanthropy had been completely dismantled, its marble monuments exposed as nothing more than the gilded gates of a secret graveyard, leaving a terrified Commonwealth to sit forever amidst the smoking, unblinded ruins of a civic faith that had been weaponized against them by their finest son. The mechanical extraction of Julian Vance's subterranean archive from the Brimmer Street basement did not merely resolve 7 cold case folders. It triggered an immediate, structural liquidation of New England's socioeconomic high command. By the morning of Friday, February 20th, 2026, the psychological shockwave had traveled far beyond the yellow crime scene tape of Beacon Hill, moving with absolute, devastating velocity through the historic boardrooms of State Street, the private dining clubs of Back Bay, and the highest administrative offices of the state capitol. The Commonwealth was entering a state of profound institutional paralysis. It was one thing for a city to discover a hidden monster in its gutters, but it was a completely different tier of existential trauma to realize that the ultimate moral anchor of their high society, the patriarch who funded their universities, directed their cultural boards, and held the financial trusts of their political elite, was an unchecked serial predator who had spent 32 years using their exclusive institutions as a screening mechanism for his victims. Inside the state capitol's executive briefing room, the atmosphere was stripped of its standard bureaucratic optimism. The governor sat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table, his face a pale, static mask of exhaustion as he reviewed the highly classified preliminary prosecution brief delivered by the state police cold case unit. Flanking him were the commissioners of banking, the directors of the state's largest charitable trusts, and the high command of the Department of Public Safety. The emergency meeting had been called not to discuss the legal mechanics of Julian Vance's upcoming trial, which was already considered an airtight forensic certainty, but to orchestrate an emergency stabilization plan for the civic and financial infrastructure of the state itself. The public doesn't understand the depth of the structural contamination yet, the Attorney General stated, his pen marking the margins of a confidential corporate flow chart that linked Vance Global Enterprises to nearly 40% of the regional maritime logistics contracts. Julian Vance wasn't an outside investor who bought his way into Boston society. His capital is the literal mortar of this city. If Vance Global falls into a chaotic bankruptcy liquidation because of these serial murder indictments, 3 of our largest state infrastructure funds go under with it. We are looking at a systemic institutional collapse disguised as a criminal prosecution. The immediate corporate fallout was already accelerating on the trading floors. The moment the state prosecutors formalized the multi-jurisdictional indictments, explicitly detailing how Vance had utilized his commercial real estate development shells to construct and maintain hidden abattoirs across 3 states, the regulatory boards of the New York Stock Exchange took the unprecedented step of freezing all trading on Vance Global assets to prevent a catastrophic market panic. But the financial bleeding could not be contained by an administrative freeze. Major institutional investors, pension funds, and international maritime shipping cartels were rushing to liquidate their peripheral associations with the Vance name, triggering a massive, silent run on the elite private banks of New England that had spent decades managing the generational wealth of the region's oldest families. While the financial markets scrambled to insulate themselves from the toxic radiation of the arrest, Dr. Clara Thorne and her team of forensic analysts were inside the high-security processing lab at the Schiller Building, conducting a detailed molecular examination of the 32 handwritten ledger books recovered from the basement document safe. The notebooks were laid out beneath long rows of ultraviolet lamps, their black leather covers smelling faintly of the climate-controlled subterranean vault where they had sat alongside the victim's jewelry. These volumes represented the true, terrifying blueprint of a psychopath's administrative genius, a multi-decade chronological diary that detailed not only the physical mechanics of his abductions, but the extensive network of social and political protective layers that Vance had systematically cultivated to ensure his permanent immunity. As Thorne deciphered the complex, alphanumeric code Vance had used to log his daily interactions, she discovered that the billionaire had treated his high-profile philanthropy as a direct investment in forensic countersurveillance. In an entry dated April 14, 1998, 3 days after the disappearance of the art history student from Newberry Street, Vance had recorded. The municipal police chief accepted the chair of the new Regional Communications Foundation this morning over a luncheon at the Union Club. A $3 million commitment from my maritime holding company will secure the complete integration of the city's fiber-optic traffic array through our private server nodes by the end of the third quarter. They believe they are building a modern network to hunt the criminal element. They do not see that by allowing me to finance the wires, they are handed a system that is fundamentally blind to my shadow. The sheep are building the fences exactly where the wolf tells them to. The notebooks revealed that every major charitable contribution Vance had made over 4 decades, every hospital wing, every university research endowment, every civic safety initiative had been strategically positioned to create a permanent conflict of interest for the very agencies tasked with enforcing the law. He had systematically compromised the integrity of the state's cultural leadership, turning the city's most prestigious families and officials into involuntary accomplices who protected his reputation because their own financial survival was inextricably tied to his investments. The psychological impact on the living members of the victims' families during this week of exposure was a complex, agonizing phenomenon. In a modest, rain-streaked apartment in South Boston, Elena Pendleton, Sarah's younger sister, now a 50-year-old high school biology teacher who had spent 32 years carrying the unresolved weight of her family's ruined history, sat staring at the televised images of the Brimmer Street excavation. For 3 decades, she had been forced to live under the suffocating cultural narrative that her sister had simply broken under the academic pressure of Harvard and thrown herself into the freezing waters of the Charles River. She had watched her parents age and die in a state of quiet, broken-hearted shame, their lives ruined by the silent, judging glances of a society that treated their daughter's disappearance as an inconvenient familial scandal rather than a historic atrocity. They made us feel like our grief was an offense to the city, Elena told Lieutenant Robert Vance during a late-night briefing at the district office, her hands trembling as she held a copy of the 1994 Missing Persons Report. Every time Julian Vance's face appeared on television, standing next to a governor or opening a new pediatric research center, my father would change the channel. He didn't know the science, he didn't have the data, but he always said that a man who smiles that perfectly while buying up the city's conscience is carrying a rod in his pocket. The city didn't want to find Sarah because finding her meant they would have to look at the man who was paying for their symphonies and building their schools. The process of stripping the Vance name from the physical architecture of the Commonwealth began with a quiet, frantic institutional urgency that looked to the public like an act of deep cultural repentance, but was recognized by the surveillance teams as a desperate attempt to erase the evidence of their own blindness. At Harvard University, stonemasons arrived at dawn with heavy pneumatic chisels and high-velocity abrasive sprays, working beneath canvas shrouds to systematically scrape the word Vance from the granite pediment of the Hall of Genomic Sciences, the white dust of the shattered letters settling over the sidewalks like old winter snow. At the Longwood Medical Area, the administrative trustees issued a historic decree stripping the billionaire's name from the Pediatric Neurology Center and liquidating his charitable trusts into an independent, court-monitored victim advocacy fund. Yet, as the physical names were erased from the stone monuments, the legal war was only beginning to harden its lines. Julian Vance's Defense Consortium, a team of 20 of the highest-paid capital defense attorneys, forensic pathologists, and jury consultants in the United States, funded by a multi-million-dollar private escrow account that had been established years in advance specifically to handle a catastrophic exposure event, had launched an unyielding, procedural counteroffensive. They flooded the state Supreme Court with hundreds of motions demanding the immediate suppression of the surreptitious DNA evidence harvested from the Manchester Terrace, claiming that the state police had executed an illegal, unconstitutional search of a private club's restricted property without a judicial warrant. They argued with a cold, corporate ferocity that the crushed cigarette filter was an inadmissible piece of genetic property, stolen by undercover agents operating outside their jurisdictional authority, and that the subsequently recorded confessions and the subterranean vault discovery were nothing but the fruit of a poisonous tree. They were attempting to use the very constitutional protections designed to shield ordinary citizens from government tyranny to build a final, technical wall around a serial killer's display cases. But the state prosecutors remained unmoving, secure in the knowledge that the dual-track testing protocol, the absolute, independent convergence of the SNP mapping, and the physical possession of Sarah Pendleton's bracelet inside a vault accessed via a combination known exclusively to the suspect, had created a legal knot that no amount of liquid capital could ever untie. As the weekend arrived, bringing with it a bitter, gray sleet that turned the streets of Beacon Hill into silent ribbons of ice, Lieutenant Robert Vance stood outside the heavy iron gates of the Brimmer Street brownstone. The excavation was nearly complete. The heavy utility trucks were preparing to transport the final crates of ledger books and forensic drapes back to the central evidence repository. The historic neighborhood was silent, its high brick row houses standing dark against the winter sky, their gas lamps casting long, flickering shadows across the granite stones. The blue-blooded society that had controlled the social and moral destiny of New England for over a century had been permanently unblinded, their fortress of philanthropy exposed as a multi-decade cover story for a slaughterhouse. The memory of Sarah Pendleton was no longer buried in the dark basement of the courthouse archive. It had become the unerasable lens through which the entire city was now forced to view its own history, a stark, mathematical proof that the greatest monsters do not wait for the dark in the lonely places of the earth. They build their empires in the light, buying the silence of the living with a smile, a monument, and a check.